They shook the world with their signatures, but behind the curtains they whispered to invisible friends, obsessed over sideburns and fenced at dawn in silence. These weren't just presidents. They were contradictions in tailored coats, haunted by ghosts, addicted to routines, and weird in ways history forgot to footnote. This isn't the story of how they led. It's how they lived. Strangely, privately, compulsively, you're about to meet America's leaders at their most unexplainable, and none of it makes sense. George Washington. Before he was a general, a founder, or the face on a dollar bill, George Washington was a man with rituals. He polished his shoes not with wax, but with rose water, believing it brought out not just a shine, but a particular dignity that could not be replicated with common polish. For him, appearance was not vanity. It was an extension of discipline. Even in the muddiest battles, the poorest weather, his boots gleamed. It wasn't for others. It was for himself. He powdered his natural hair rather than donning a wig like many of his contemporaries. The choice was deliberate. Wigs were fashion, yes, but also symbols of status. Washington, however, didn't need imitation. He powdered his hair because it fit his vision of restraint. Controlled, symmetrical, elevated. To him, leadership began with self-mastery, even if it began with hair. But beneath the order was a deep fascination with mystery. During the Revolutionary War, Washington authorized the creation of one of the earliest known American spy rings. He funded it with discretionary war expenses, but managed its details with quiet obsession. Ciphers, coded messages, and invisible ink flowed through his channels. Spies with aliases sent intelligence across enemy lines. The famous Culper ring operated under such secrecy that even some members didn't know each other's names. Washington wasn't just a strategist on the battlefield. He was a shadow operator in the back rooms. One of his favorite tools was a kind of invisible ink that revealed itself only under heat. His belief in secrecy was more than tactical. It was philosophical. Among the oddest of his habits, Washington named his dogs with a sense of irony or commentary that most wouldn't expect from a man remembered for stone-faced solemnity. He had foxhounds named Drunkard, Tipsy, and Vulcan. Vulcan was likely a reference to the Roman god of fire and the forge, a strange nod for a hunting dog, unless one considers Washington's habit of viewing every aspect of his estate as symbolic. The names weren't jokes, they were reflections, like a quiet inside joke told to no one, preserved in the company of animals that wouldn't answer back. Washington also maintained a near sacred stillness during meetings, but if someone sneezed, especially if they sneezed 3 times, he would pause entirely. He believed triple sneezes were a form of divine punctuation. Not necessarily good or bad, just meaningful. Soldiers and aides recorded him halting mid-order, leaning back slightly and murmuring, "It means something." Then he would return to the conversation without explanation. The room never asked what it meant. They knew he wouldn't say. There were other tics. He addressed trees in letters, not metaphorically, literally. On several occasions, he penned journal entries or notes to specific trees on his estate, describing their growth, their symmetry, or their decline. In one note, he apologized to a chestnut tree for trimming its limbs too aggressively. In another, he wrote, "Your shadow has cooled men better than any tent." These were not stylized flourishes. He never published them. They were for himself, a kind of private communion with the landscape he spent his life managing. Washington believed in the power of small, silent things. His letters to friends often contained single-line reflections like, "No battle is ever won with a loud voice," or "Even shoes speak." His library held more books on moral philosophy and agronomy than on war. He rarely quoted scripture directly, but he paraphrased it constantly, bending it to fit his tone, his timing, and his purpose. He was terrified of being seen as a king. That fear guided many of his strangest choices. He wore plain civilian clothes to his inauguration. He refused to sit on a throne-like chair. He rejected the title His Excellency in favor of Mr. My President, a term that would become so common we forget it had to be invented. And still, in all that restraint, there was control. His gestures were calibrated, his pauses curated. Washington rarely smiled. When he did, it startled people. One observer wrote, "It was like the room itself exhaled." He did not speak quickly. He did not blink often. He studied those who did. He died quietly at Mount Vernon, refusing morphine, whispering instructions, even in pain. His final words were said to be, "'Tis well." And yet the man who followed him, John Adams, was not still, not polished, and not mysterious. He was brilliant, chaotic, irritable, and driven by forces even he couldn't always explain. Where Washington crafted silence, Adams exploded with sound, and history was about to get much louder. John Adams. John Adams believed in truth, but not always in peace. He entered every room like it owed him an apology, and if it didn't offer one, he usually found a way to extract it. Where Washington was composed, Adams was combustible. He had no poker face, no slow-burning silence. His mind was always 5 topics ahead of the conversation, and his body followed awkwardly, twitching, pacing, blurting. He was the kind of man who won arguments even when no one else knew they were happening. He had a daily ritual of walking in perfect, obsessive circles in his yard, sometimes for hours. Neighbors called it eccentric. Adams called it mental arrangement. To him, geometry was clarity. The act of repeating a single closed path helped him think. He once composed the outline for a 30-page treaty entirely while circling a gooseberry bush. He believed the mind aligned with motion, that thoughts could be smoothed like stones simply by orbiting them. He drank a tankard of hard cider every morning. Not wine, not water, cider. Fresh, bitter, and bracing. He believed it set the gut straight and prevented melancholy. A doctor once told him it was likely bad for his digestion. Adams replied, "So is Congress." He refused to use banks, claimed they made men dishonest. Instead, he paid in silver, hoarded coin, and distrusted paper notes. He said a man should feel the weight of his obligations. He often carried coins in the lining of his waistcoat and would weigh them in his hand during intense discussions. It unnerved people. One British envoy described Adams as a man with flint behind his eyes and metal in his palms. He chewed his fingernails raw when frustrated, so raw that Abigail, his wife, once sewed him thumb guards. He wore them exactly once, threw them into a fireplace, declaring, "A nation cannot be defended by gloves." His parrot, a gift from a French diplomat, was taught to speak phrases like "liberty forever" and "equality now." It also learned a string of curses, which Adams denied teaching it. When it cursed at Thomas Jefferson during a visit, Adams laughed so hard he fell off his chair. He never corrected the bird. "It's a creature of judgment," he said. He once wrote a 17-page letter on the virtues of potatoes. In it, he outlined the philosophical superiority of root vegetables over fruits, claiming they were closer to the human condition, buried, hardened, and enduring. He sent it unsolicited to the Royal Society in London. They did not respond. He loathed aristocracy, but dressed like one. He wore cravats starched into stiff peaks, and powdered his thinning hair obsessively. He once delayed a state dinner because his shoelaces did not match. He said, "Chaos begins at the ankle." He fell asleep during dinners, often, suddenly, and without apology. Once, in the middle of a heated discussion on trade policy, he dozed off with a spoon halfway to his mouth. No one dared wake him. 15 minutes later, he sat up and resumed the conversation mid-sentence, as if nothing had happened. Adams wrote more than most modern novelists. Letters, essays, legal briefs, treaties, but he also annotated everything. Margins filled with arguments against his own sentences. He once wrote, "I disagree with this paragraph," and never rewrote it. He preferred debate to perfection. He believed that the presidency should be neither glamorous nor personal. He refused to shake hands. He referred to the White House as this great shell of national silence. He hated living in it, complained about the drafts, the unfinished walls, the leaky ceilings, said it was less a home than a cold statement. He was the first president to live in the White House and the first to fill it with audible dissatisfaction. His friendship, and later rivalry, with Thomas Jefferson defined much of his adult life. They were ideological brothers, then strangers, then cautious friends again. They argued about everything: the French Revolution, states' rights, the role of the executive, the proper definition of republic. But in the final years of their lives, they wrote long, philosophical letters to one another, less like rivals, more like weary survivors of the same storm. Adams died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. His last words were, Thomas Jefferson survives. Jefferson had died earlier that same day, and in death, as in life, the two men remained inextricably entwined, arguing across time. But while Adams wrote and raged and roared, Jefferson dreamed. He built a house into a mountain, cut miracles out of the Bible, and filled his world with quiet, radical order. Thomas Jefferson believed the world could be rearranged into logic. Where Adams circled his garden in fury, Jefferson walked the halls of Monticello with measured grace, dreaming of a republic shaped like a sentence, balanced, elegant, and always under construction. He was not simply a writer or a president. He was a designer of systems, of buildings, of ideas. He didn't speak with volume. He spoke with structure. Monticello was his laboratory. He designed it himself, revised it constantly, and lived inside it like a question he was always trying to answer. Its walls were filled with mechanical contraptions, a clock that told the day of the week using weights, a revolving service door so servants could appear without sound, a dumbwaiter that rose through the floor carrying bottles of French wine. He never stopped changing it, never declared it finished. He once wrote, "The perfect house is a contradiction in motion." He collected weather data with a passion bordering on obsession. Every morning, no matter where he was, he recorded temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, humidity. If he was traveling, he brought portable instruments with him. He did this for over 50 years. There are entire ledgers filled with nothing but numbers, carefully penned. He believed understanding the atmosphere would reveal the temperament of nations. He called the weather a slow whisper from God. He invented a swivel chair, used it to draft the Declaration of Independence. It squeaked. He didn't care. He rotated in it constantly while writing, believing movement loosened the mind. The chair itself was an act of subtle rebellion, a rejection of the rigid postures of monarchy in favor of motion and thought. Jefferson didn't believe in miracles, not the divine kind. He took a razor blade to the New Testament and cut out every mention of angels, resurrection, or supernatural intervention. What remained was a slim volume he called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Just teachings, stripped of divinity. He read it every night before bed. He never published it, said it was a private exercise in clarity. He kept a mockingbird named Dick. It sat on his shoulder, sang while he read, and sometimes joined him at the dinner table. When Jefferson played the violin, the bird would trill in harmony. He let it roam Monticello freely. Once, when Dick escaped out a window, Jefferson spent half a day coaxing it back with bits of biscuit and softly hummed sonatas. He was obsessed with linguistics, knew Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, and some Arabic. He studied Native American languages, compiled dictionaries, believed that every lost word was a lost worldview. He once wrote, "To erase a language is to amputate a people's memory." Jefferson rarely raised his voice, but his contradictions were deafening. He owned over 600 people during his lifetime, enslaved men, women, and children who worked the land, cooked his meals, raised his children. He wrote about liberty with a pen gripped by a hand that signed ledgers of human bondage. He knew it. He admitted it. But he never changed it. "We have the wolf by the ear," he said of slavery. "We can neither hold him nor safely let him go." He died in debt. He spent lavishly on books, on architecture, on wine. Always wine. Over 20,000 bottles passed through his cellar during his life. He never learned moderation, not in ideas, not in design, not in appetite. His feet were always cold. He soaked them in cold water every morning, even in winter. He believed it prevented illness, said it tempered the nerves. Servants begged him to stop after he fell ill. He refused. It was part of his philosophy. Discipline through discomfort. He wrote letters compulsively. Over 20,000 survive. Some were political, others philosophical. Some were just lists, books to buy, seeds to plant, windows to fix. Every line was ordered. Even his grocery lists had margin notes. He distrusted cities, called them a sore on the body of the republic, preferred rural life, slow conversations, the measured pulse of farmland. He believed virtue lived in dirt, not marble. When he founded the University of Virginia, he designed every detail, the layout, the syllabus, the font on the diplomas. He banned religious instruction, said education should be free from superstition. The school was his final experiment, an Enlightenment engine in brick and mortar. Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, same day as John Adams, same date as the Declaration they both had breathed into life. His last words, "Is it the 4th?" It was. And as his breath left the room, the nation turned toward a smaller man, one who had written no declaration, founded no university, and avoided all fanfare, James Madison. He didn't speak loudly, but his mind was the Constitution's spine. James Madison. He stood just over 5 feet tall, weighed around 100 pounds, and spoke in a voice so faint that, even in small rooms, people leaned forward instinctively. Yet James Madison, modest in stature and soft in tone, engineered one of the most ambitious political documents in human history. The Constitution was his, at least in blueprint. He believed in frameworks, in clarity, in systems that could outlive their designers. He didn't crave credit, he craved coherence. But behind the careful handwriting and patient logic lived a man shaped as much by anxiety as by reason. Madison was sickly, thin, pale, prone to seizures, and chronically fatigued. He spent much of his youth studying while others ran. He once told a friend he feared dying suddenly from overexertion of thought. In response, he planned his days with monastic precision: study, tea, walking, more study, and long silent observation. Even in conversation, he rarely spoke unless he'd already written his response in his head. He feared thunderstorms deeply. As a boy, he would hide in cellars at the first distant rumble. As a man, he closed his shutters, turned off lights, and sat in darkness, waiting for it to pass. He once told a friend that lightning shatters thought itself. That wasn't metaphor. He wore wool stockings year-round, even in Virginia's swampy summers. He said the consistency helped regulate his body temperature. Doctors begged him to try lighter fabrics. He declined, claiming it was a mental arrangement. He kept extras in his desk drawer and changed them meticulously, twice daily. He feared mirrors, not as superstition, but as principle. He believed vanity corroded character, and that frequent glances in reflective surfaces encouraged moral decay. He had nearly all mirrors removed from his home and insisted guests refrain from commenting on appearance. Once, when complimented on a waistcoat, he changed clothes mid-dinner. He refused to be painted smiling, believed it made leaders look unserious. Portrait artists found him difficult. He insisted on plain backgrounds, minimal flourish, and a pose that suggested contemplative restraint. One painter noted that Madison sat like a man watching his own funeral, but he was funny in his own way, dry, quiet, and occasionally savage. When asked whether he enjoyed politics, he said, "It is like swallowing thorns to prove one's appetite." He wrote in code, even for trivial matters. Invisible ink, ciphered alphabets, obscure references. At one point during the Constitutional Convention, he wrote letters to Jefferson using a cipher so complex that Jefferson later admitted he'd burned the messages rather than decode them. Madison didn't mind. He believed privacy was the foundation of free thought. He believed certain foods triggered emotion. He called them agitating agents: red meat, garlic, onions. He avoided them, fearing they stirred passion. He favored boiled vegetables, rice, and weak tea. He believed clarity of mind began at the dinner plate. When guests brought wine, he thanked them and left it sealed. He often wrote with a quill so thin it left barely visible ink trails. When asked why, he said he preferred writing that was seen only by the serious. Some of his journals from the 1780s are nearly illegible unless held at an angle. Archivists still debate whether this was intentional encryption or just a failing pen. His marriage to Dolly Madison was one of contrast. She was vibrant, gregarious, endlessly social. She threw legendary parties. He stood in corners, nodding. They balanced one another. She'd wave. He'd calculate. At events, she spoke. He watched. Yet in their letters, his affection was clear, tender, precise, with moments of warmth that never surfaced in public. He was deeply afraid of being buried alive. A common fear in his era, but for Madison, it was a fixation. He left specific instructions that his burial be delayed by at least 72 hours after death, just in case. He also instructed his doctor to strike the chest once, firmly, to confirm. The doctor did not fulfill the request. He died reading Virgil, alone except for a servant who later said he looked satisfied and slightly amused. His final words were, "Nothing more than a change of scene." He was buried under a modest stone. No grand tomb, no elaborate marker, just the quiet architect of a nation, returned to the earth he studied. And after him came James Monroe, a man with war scars in his shoulder, revolution in his blood, and a memory so stubborn he once forgot his own birthday, but never forgot where he buried his enemies. James Monroe. James Monroe carried a bullet in his shoulder for most of his life. It was lodged there during the Revolutionary War when he took a musket ball to the upper chest while storming a trench. The wound should have killed him. It didn't. The bullet stayed. It was never removed. He lived with it for decades, a permanent souvenir from a nation not yet born. Embedded in the tissue of his body, he called it a reminder of beginnings. He was the last president to wear a powdered wig. Long after the fashion had faded, long after his peers had moved to simpler styles, Monroe still powdered and tied his hair. Some said it was nostalgia, others, ritual. He believed in presentation, order, symmetry, impression. He once wrote, "The Republic must first appear composed if it hopes to be believed so." He wore Revolutionary War-style clothing long into the 19th century, high-collared coats, waist sashes, breeches. To some it seemed theatrical. To Monroe, it was continuity. He saw himself as a living thread between the founding generation and the present. When critics mocked his attire, he responded flatly, "My jacket has survived more wars than your vote." He carried a cane not for support, but for punctuation. He used it while speaking, not dramatically, but subtly. A tap to the floor for emphasis, a lean against the desk while reading dispatches. It was his metronome, his pointer, his line in the sand. During one particularly tense cabinet meeting, he laid it across the table and said, "Cross this, and you speak treason." He once forgot his own birthday. In 1820, after a particularly draining year of negotiations and travel, Monroe missed the date entirely. It wasn't until several days later, when a friend mentioned it in a letter, that he realized. His response, "Time has become circular. It hardly seems to matter where the circle begins." He refused to eat in front of strangers. He believed it made men appear animalistic, and that chewing dulled the mind. At state dinners, he would take only sips of wine and small cuts of bread. He saved his real meals for private quarters. Even when offered delicacies from visiting dignitaries, he declined with a bow and the phrase, "My appetite prefers solitude." He once named trees on his estate. Not metaphorically, literally. He gave them names, titles, and sometimes backstories. An oak was the Colonel. A willow near the creek was Lady Wept. He referred to them in his journals as if they were staff. "Lady Wept is declining," he wrote in the spring of 1823. "But her shade still instructs the garden." He had a deep aversion to banks. Not just a philosophical opposition. He distrusted them on a personal level. He preferred coins to paper, bartered when possible, and was known to keep small purses of silver hidden in furniture. When advised to open a line of credit to finance a diplomatic trip, he responded, "I'll not trade the nation's honor for the word of a banker." His memory was oddly selective. He could recall treaty clauses verbatim, but struggled with names. He once referred to a French diplomat as the one with the teeth. During his presidency, he met a senator 3 times before remembering his face. Yet he could quote entire passages of Cicero and military strategy texts without pause. He did not speak much in public. He preferred to let his policies speak for him. He gave only a few addresses, and when he did, they were short, structured, and firm. He believed words were currency and disliked those who spent them for applause. He was wounded in 2 wars and presided over an era so politically calm that it became known as the era of good feelings. But Monroe knew that silence doesn't always mean peace. He once said, "A quiet room may still burn at the corners." In private, he was often melancholic. Friends noted his long silences, his habit of staring out windows for hours. He feared becoming irrelevant even while in office. His journals are filled with rhetorical questions. What remains for the soldier when the flags are folded? Will they remember that I stood? He died on July 4th, 1831, exactly 5 years after Jefferson and Adams. Another coincidence, or perhaps another symmetry he would have admired. As he was laid to rest, the bullet in his shoulder still remained. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams did not walk through life, he marched. Everything he did with the rhythm of urgency. He was the son of a president, the scholar of scholars, the man who knew 6 languages before most men knew 6 kinds of bread. But behind the erudition, behind the careful cutting logic, there was something else, a restless, compulsive intensity. He didn't just want to serve. He wanted to outthink, outwork, and outlast everyone who had ever tried. He began his diary at the age of 12. He never stopped. By the time he died, the pages numbered in the tens of thousands, an obsessive, near-daily record of his thoughts, actions, grievances, philosophical arguments, and garden updates. He wrote about sunrise colors and the angle of passing carriages, debates in the house, his breakfast, often cocoa and dry toast, and his doubts about immortality, all with the same gravity. His diary was his confessional, his mirror, and his battlefield. It remains one of the most comprehensive personal records of any figure in American history. He didn't sleep much, often just 4 hours a night. He believed long sleep dulled the mind. Instead, he rose before dawn, read scripture in Greek, and walked long distances, frequently over 5 miles before breakfast. On more than one occasion, he walked over 20 miles in a day simply to calm himself. His body followed his brain like a loyal servant, and he punished it when it slowed. He practiced fencing into his 60s, sword in hand at sunrise, breath fogging in the cold, posture precise. It was part discipline, part meditation. He believed fencing sharpened the mind. His sparring partner, usually a retired officer or an unfortunate clerk, rarely enjoyed the session. Adams didn't talk while fencing. He just stared and struck. He once said, "The sword corrects that which conversation cannot." He had no tolerance for small talk, or idleness, or people who enjoyed either. At social events, he would often sit alone, reading a book he brought from home. If approached, he answered curtly and returned to his page. When his wife reminded him that being president included diplomacy in drawing rooms, he replied, "If they wish my thoughts, they are printed." He was blunt, often abrasively so. He referred to Andrew Jackson as a barbarian who cannot write a sentence of grammar. He described political opponents as fungus from the swamp of corruption. But he could also be poetic. In one letter to his son, he wrote, "The heart must labor as the hands do, or it will rot." As president, he was competent, cerebral, and widely disliked. His intelligence alienated, his temper smoldered, his vision was grand. A national observatory, federal support for scientific advancement, an interstate system of roads and canals. But Congress resisted. Critics called him elitist. He called them provincial. Most of his proposals died on the floor. His own cabinet barely supported him. He kept lists of betrayals in the margins of his meeting notes, crossed out names with ink so heavy it bled through the pages. He believed most men were incapable of long-term vision. He once wrote, "The present is always easier to eat than the future." After losing re-election to Andrew Jackson, a man he loathed with operatic intensity, Adams didn't disappear. He returned to public life with a vengeance, running for Congress and winning. He served as a representative for 17 years, longer than he had been president, and in the House, he found his voice. He fought tirelessly against slavery, challenged the gag rule, which banned discussion of abolition. He argued, debated, shouted, petitioned. His colleagues tried to censure him. He stood undaunted. Day after day, session after session, John Quincy Adams rose and spoke, and when words failed, he used silence. On one occasion, he simply stood holding a petition in his hand until the room fell quiet. In 1841, he defended the Africans of the Amistad in front of the Supreme Court, an act of moral clarity decades ahead of his time. His closing argument was 4 hours long. No theatrics, just history, principle, and fire. He kept a pet alligator, gifted by the Marquis de Lafayette, which lived in a bathroom in the East Room of the White House. He liked showing it to guests without warning. He said it was the only creature in this house whose politics I understand. He died on the floor of the House of Representatives after collapsing during a session. He never left the job. He never stopped. His final words, whispered hours later, were, "This is the last of earth. I am content." And with that, the scholar-statesman was gone. But contentment would not describe the man who followed him. Andrew Jackson would come with fury, with scars, with duels unresolved and enemies unforgotten. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't trust many people. He didn't trust banks, didn't trust the federal government, didn't trust paper money, and didn't particularly trust anyone who smiled without a reason. He entered the presidency with a bullet lodged near his heart from a duel and left it with more enemies than most presidents make in 2 lifetimes. Where John Quincy Adams was cerebral and rigid, Jackson was visceral, sharp-edged, impulsive, and entirely unfiltered. He was the first president to survive an assassination attempt. In 1835, a man approached him with 2 pistols and fired at point-blank range. Both guns misfired. Jackson, 70 years old at the time, responded not with fear, but by beating the would-be assassin repeatedly with his cane until the man was subdued. It took several men to pull the president off. That wasn't a reflex. That was Jackson's nature. If you attacked, you were going to be answered. His cane, in fact, was nearly as famous as he was. He didn't need it to walk, though age had stiffened his joints. He used it like punctuation, to command silence, to threaten, to emphasize. He once pointed it at a senator during a heated argument and said, "Be grateful this Congress has rules." Jackson never backed down from a fight. He fought in over a dozen duels during his lifetime. Though many were settled without shots fired, in one that wasn't, he allowed his opponent to shoot first, taking the bullet square in the chest, and then calmly raised his pistol and killed the man. The bullet remained in Jackson's body for the rest of his life, festering occasionally, but never removed. His explanation was simple. I intended to kill him, and I did. He called his fireplace the only honest thing in Washington. He would often sit in front of it for hours, muttering to himself, stoking the flames, feeding it with letters or pamphlets he found objectionable. Aid journals mentioned the smell of scorched parchment and tobacco as permanent features of his office. He had a lifelong vendetta against the National Bank. He saw it as a den of corruption, a parasite on democracy. He referred to its head, Nicholas Biddle, as a serpent, and swore to crush the institution. He succeeded. He vetoed the recharter bill and withdrew federal deposits, effectively killing the bank. The economy spiraled, but Jackson's conviction never wavered. I killed it, he said, and I'll kill it again if it rises. He carved insults into trees on his estate, the Hermitage. If a neighbor crossed him, Jackson would etch phrases like "coward's oak" or "traitor's elm" into nearby bark. The trees became his private battleground. Some were marked, axed, and left to rot as symbolic executions. He owned a parrot named Pole, who reportedly picked up on Jackson's colorful language. At Jackson's funeral, the bird began cursing so loudly and persistently that it had to be removed from the ceremony. Witnesses described the scene as undignified but accurate. He harbored a deep belief in omens. If a bird flew too low, or if his horse stopped suddenly without cause, Jackson would cancel meetings, reverse decisions, or call in his personal pastor. He never considered himself superstitious, only alert to God's whispers. Jackson rarely slept well. Plagued by chronic pain from his wounds, he often wandered the halls at night, whispering prayers and curses in equal measure. He sometimes wrote letters to long-dead soldiers, addressed simply to brother in arms. His handwriting, already a tight scrawl, grew almost illegible in these midnight drafts. He kept a cannon outside his bedroom window, not ornamental, functional, a relic from his military days, fully loaded, aimed at nothing in particular. When asked why, he replied, "It keeps my dreams straight." He believed in the Union above all. When South Carolina threatened secession, he responded not with diplomacy, but with a declaration of war. "Disunion by armed force is treason," he wrote, "and treason must be punished." He was prepared to lead troops personally. He meant it, but his presidency also bore one of its darkest marks, the Indian Removal Act. Jackson signed it in 1830, paving the way for the forced displacement of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. Thousands died on the Trail of Tears, a legacy of violence and removal that history has not and should not forgive. Jackson defended it as necessary for civilization. Critics, even in his time, called it monstrous. He dismissed them. "The path of duty," he wrote, "is rarely paved with agreement." He retired to the Hermitage, sickly but proud. He surrounded himself with old battle maps and letters. He wrote his will by hand, included a clause that requested his slaves not be sold until the debts were settled. Some were freed, most were not. He died in 1845. His last words, "Be good children, and we will all meet in heaven." Whether he believed it was unclear. Jackson often spoke of heaven, but rarely of peace. And after the storm of Jackson came a man who once styled his sideburns for over an hour each morning, smaller in stature, polished in appearance, and utterly obsessed with control, Martin Van Buren. And he believed every political problem had an elegant solution until he met one that didn't. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren believed in appearance, not as vanity, but as strategy. To him, politics was theater, and every actor had to be dressed for the part. He was meticulous. Every morning he spent upwards of an hour grooming his sideburns, shaping them into symmetrical silken waves that framed his face like a pair of commas. They became his signature, iconic, deliberate, and a kind of armor against the unpredictable chaos of the era. He didn't just groom himself, he curated himself. He wore lavender-scented gloves, always, even during campaign stops, even while riding. He claimed the scent steadied his nerves and reminded him of delicate order. His handkerchiefs matched, embroidered with a discreet MVB and lightly perfumed. When asked about the eccentricity, he replied, "A nation's leader must never appear undone." Van Buren was the first president born after the American Revolution, the first to be born a citizen of the United States, not a British subject. His Dutch was better than his English in childhood. He retained the accent for life, which critics mocked, though never to his face. He learned early that precision in language was power. He wielded words like tools, rarely wasting one. He avoided outbursts, preferring calculated ambiguity. If Jackson was a cannon, Van Buren was a scalpel. He hosted an all-orange dinner once. Tablecloths, lighting, even the food. Carrots, sweet potatoes, pumpkin soup, persimmons. Guests were confused, but no one questioned him. He said it was a tribute to color as harmony, though one attendee believed it was a veiled reference to Dutch royal colors. Either way, it became one of Washington's strangest social events. He never raised his voice, not once, not even when furious. He believed volume was the final refuge of the insecure. He once fired an aide with a single glance and a folded note that read, "Your services are concluded. My thanks." He was a political operator to his core, founder of the Democratic Party in its modern form, master of backroom deals, architect of alliances. He was called the Little Magician for his ability to maneuver through opposition without ever appearing to move at all. He once said, "Let others carry torches, I will lay the bricks." And he did, quietly, efficiently, with a mind attuned to the long game. But when he reached the presidency, all that calculation met the force of events he couldn't control. The Panic of 1837, an economic collapse triggered by speculative lending and the death of the National Bank, hit months into his term. Banks failed, businesses folded, unemployment soared. Van Buren's calm demeanor now looked detached. His refusal to intervene directly became a liability. He believed the market would self-correct, that the government should not interfere, but breadlines don't wait for ideology. His critics called him Martin Van Ruin. The nickname stuck. He didn't flinch. He reorganized federal finances, created an independent treasury system, explained it in long, careful memos, but the public wanted emotion. Van Buren gave them logic. They wanted anger. He gave them lavender gloves and macroeconomics. He traveled with a mirror, not for vanity, again for calibration. He believed facial expression had to match tone precisely. If he frowned while reading, he would pause and adjust. Once a staffer caught him practicing neutral expressions before a major speech. Van Buren nodded at the man and said, "Language without symmetry is betrayal." He rarely used metaphors. Said they muddled conclusions. His speeches were dense, orderly, and devoid of flourish. They read more like contracts than calls to action, but they were airtight. Even his enemies struggled to rebut him. They just resented that he never gave them anything quotable. He collected miniature portraits, small, oval paintings of political allies, family, rivals. He arranged them in a study like a battlefield map, repositioned them weekly, called it visualizing consequence. No one was sure if this was strategy or superstition. He refused to sleep in silence, kept a clock in every room ticking audibly, claimed it reminded him time governs all men. He believed insomnia was the result of forgetting that fact. He was, despite everything, popular abroad. Charles Dickens met him and described him as a man of particular charm and impossible smoothness. European observers admired his Polish. Americans, still recovering from economic ruin, felt less enchanted. He ran for re-election, lost. Ran again years later under the Free Soil Party, opposing the expansion of slavery, lost again. By then, his sideburns had turned gray, his gloves still lavender. He retired quietly, wrote little, reflected a lot, never admitted fault, never sought redemption. His papers are filled with statements like, "I did what reason allowed, the rest belongs to time." He died in 1862 as the Civil War cracked the country open, but the man who followed him, briefly, barely, was something entirely different. William Henry Harrison. He spoke for nearly 2 hours in freezing rain and didn't survive the month. William Henry Harrison. He was born into Virginia aristocracy, raised among revolutionaries, and trained as a soldier. But when William Henry Harrison finally took the presidential oath at the age of 68, he wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about proving a point, that he was still strong, still sharp, still unbreakable. And so, in a cold March wind, with rain beginning to fall, Harrison stood without a coat, without gloves, and delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, 8,445 words, nearly 2 hours long. He refused to speak from prepared notes. He believed preparation made a man seem weak. He believed oration revealed inner spine. It was a fatal mistake. 31 days later, he was dead, officially from pneumonia, unofficially from stubbornness. But what happened in those 31 days has taken on a peculiar life of its own. Less presidency, more myth. Harrison remains the shortest-serving president in American history, and yet his quirks and contradictions offer more than just a footnote. They offer a glimpse into a man who believed presence was more important than policy, and that symbolism could outlive legislation. He used to speak to his hat before giving speeches, quietly, as if calibrating tone. Aides assumed it was superstition or rehearsal, but when asked, he said, "The hat reminds me to be brief. The irony is immortal." Harrison had been a hero long before he became a president. At the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, he led U.S. forces against Native American warriors, a battle that earned him national fame and a lifelong moniker. Old Tippecanoe, they called him, a name so aggressively frontier that it stuck through multiple decades and rebrands. He parlayed that name into politics. His campaign for the presidency was engineered like a traveling show. There were rolling barrels of hard cider, giant log cabins on wheels, slogans, and jingles. His handlers crafted a narrative that Harrison was a humble man of the people, born in a log cabin, sipping cider with farmers. It wasn't true. He was wealthy, educated, connected, but in the 1840s, image was finally beginning to overtake reality, and Harrison was the first presidential candidate to run as a fully fictionalized version of himself. He believed strongly in the power of minimalism in government, except when it came to ceremony. He demanded military bands for every appearance, brass buttons on all uniforms, and formal hats on doormen. He once delayed a meeting for an hour because the White House staff had incorrectly folded a ceremonial tablecloth. He wrote with a quill he claimed was made from the feather of a hawk he'd killed in Ohio. The feather was so brittle the ink would often bleed through the page. He kept writing with it anyway, believing that the imperfections gave the document a trace of truth. He didn't believe in comfort, not for himself, not for others. He slept on a narrow wooden bed, insisted on cold baths every morning, sometimes at dawn, sometimes outdoors, and called soft pillows invitations to moral decay. He wrote his own speeches, long, dense, winding, filled with references to Roman senators, revolutionary ancestors, and military metaphors. During his campaign, his staff begged him to shorten his remarks. He refused. "Let the people learn to listen," he said, "or let them leave." He rarely smiled in portraits, not out of pride, but because he thought portraits should look like statues. The face must be frozen, he said, so that time cannot embarrass it. He insisted that the White House be kept colder than necessary. Fireplaces were left unlit, windows opened. Some believed this contributed to his fatal illness. Others believed he simply liked the air sharp. He kept his personal correspondence tied with leather cords, sorted by battle, 1811, 1812, 1813. He would reread them often, correcting margins, annotating mistakes, as if wars too could be revised. His policies never had time to form. He had plans, ideas, but time collapsed before pen could meet paper. Still, he held regular meetings with advisors, even as his health deteriorated, even when he coughed between words, even when he couldn't sit for long without trembling. He gave orders from bed during his final days, called them dispatches. The doctors bled him, fed him warm wine, wrapped him in poultices. Nothing worked. He drifted in and out of coherence. His last words were a fragmented sentence, spoken not to his wife or his doctors, but strangely to Vice President John Tyler. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." And then he was gone. The country was stunned. The Constitution was unclear. Would Tyler now become president or simply acting president? Tyler had an answer. He declared himself fully president. No acting, no asterisk, and in doing so, he created a precedent that would change the line of succession forever. He also brought with him courtroom airs, salt in his shoes, and letters sung aloud while they were written. John Tyler was next, and he didn't wait for permission. John Tyler. John Tyler came to the presidency not by victory, but by vacancy. When William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into office, the Constitution was vague on what came next. It didn't say if the vice president became the president or merely acted as one. Tyler didn't ask. He moved into the White House, took the oath, issued orders, signed letters as President of the United States. Critics protested. Congress hesitated. Tyler didn't blink. He believed in decisive momentum. He called it constitutional inevitability. Others called it a power grab. He became the first vice president to assume the presidency upon the death of his predecessor, and in doing so set a precedent that would guide every future succession. But Tyler's term would be defined by more than just legal footnotes. He was a man of rigid principle, deep pride, and a streak of idiosyncrasy that ran through every layer of his public and private life. Tyler held mock trials for his pets. It was not a joke. His children and guests were often summoned to play judge or jury while the family dog or parrot stood accused of various misdemeanors. Chewing slippers, stealing food, making noise during naps. Tyler would cross-examine, deliver verdicts, and pronounce sentences. Most offenders were pardoned after a few stern words and a ceremonious pat on the head. He believed in moral grounding. Literally, he sprinkled salt in his shoes before important meetings, claiming it connected him to the truth. Staff reported finding small piles of salt beneath his desk, inside his boots, and occasionally in his bed. When asked about it, he said only, "Salt remembers the sea. It reminds men they are not gods." He sang his correspondence aloud, every letter, every memo. He believed the rhythm of language mattered and that reading aloud revealed falsehoods. Sometimes he sang them operatically, other times like psalms. Aides grew used to the sound of Tyler pacing his office, humming legislative proposals as if they were church hymns. He distrusted silence. Not in meetings, but in rooms. He filled the White House with ticking clocks, music boxes, and wind chimes. He said noise was the spine of the waking mind. He reportedly once stormed out of a reception because the musicians paused too long between songs. Tyler was a strict constitutionalist, perhaps the most rigid of any president. He vetoed bill after bill, often frustrating his own party. Whigs had supported him reluctantly on the ticket with Harrison, expecting to control the agenda, but Tyler, once in office, charted his own path. They called him his accidency, a snub that only deepened his resolve. He was eventually expelled from his own party while still in office, the first and only time that's ever happened. The Whigs disowned him. His cabinet resigned. Congress stopped inviting him to strategy sessions. Tyler governed alone, with a shrinking circle of allies and increasing reliance on the veto pen. And yet he was also a man of enormous charm. Friends described him as warm when engaged, terribly polite, and addicted to courtly flourish. He wrote poetry, hosted musical evenings, fell in love with a woman 30 years his junior while in office, and married her, the only president ever to wed during his presidency. He was a father of 15 children, more than any other U.S. president. His youngest daughter was born when he was in his 70s. He ran his household like a court. complete with rotating seating arrangements and weekly etiquette reviews. He distrusted banks and kept small caches of coin hidden throughout his home, behind books, in hollowed-out drawers, inside hat boxes. He claimed it was to test the patience of thieves. Some were never found. He had a flair for dramatics. Once, when confronted with a petition he disliked, he dropped it into a fireplace without reading it. Fires, he said, are the truest editors. Tyler supported the annexation of Texas, a position that deepened sectional tensions and set the stage for the Mexican-American War. He knew it would be controversial. He did it anyway. He believed manifest destiny was not a political tool, but a moral compass. A continent, he wrote, is a gift wrapped in obligation. After his presidency, Tyler drifted from the national spotlight, but not from history. As the Civil War loomed, he sided with the Confederacy. He chaired a peace conference aimed at preventing secession. But once it failed, he embraced the Southern cause. He was elected to the Confederate Congress before he died, making him the only U.S. president to become a formal enemy of the United States. When he died in 1862, Abraham Lincoln refused to acknowledge his death with the usual honors. No flags were lowered, no public mourning declared. The Union considered him a traitor, but the South gave him a hero's burial. And there, beneath two flags, ended the life of a president who began in ambiguity and left in defiance. And the man who followed him would serve only as a placeholder until death came knocking once more, James K. Polk, who treated the presidency like a battlefield and burned himself out trying to conquer everything in sight. James K. Polk. James K. Polk entered the White House with a to-do list. 4 goals, written down, memorized, measured. He told his cabinet on the first day of his presidency what he planned to accomplish and vowed that once those items were checked off, he would leave office. No re-election, no extension, just the mission. He was not a visionary, not a dreamer. He was a tactical executor, one of the few presidents who actually did what he said he would do, and did it faster than anyone expected. But behind that precision was a man so obsessed with control, order, and secrecy that even his personal life reflected the same manic efficiency. He didn't just lead, he managed. His presidency, his household, his health, his legacy, like they were all pieces of a single rapidly expiring contract. He worked constantly, refused to take days off, held meetings on Sundays, micromanaged everything. He read every piece of incoming and outgoing mail himself, every appointment, speech, proclamation, edited by his own hand. Aides described his pace as suffocating. He kept a diary, dry, factual, never emotional, where he recorded his daily actions with a detachment of a clerk, checking off inventory. It is perhaps the most obsessively detailed presidential journal in history. Polk was not charismatic. He avoided public events. He rarely smiled in portraits, and even more rarely in person. One visiting diplomat remarked that Polk spoke with the precision of a judge and the warmth of a ledger, yet his power was undeniable. He understood pressure, understood leverage, understood that being underestimated was an advantage. He had no hobbies, no diversions, not even books beyond those required for governing. His idea of leisure was reviewing land surveys. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk, was his closest advisor, an intellectual equal, fiercely devout, and staunchly protective of his time. She banned dancing and card games at the White House. Wine was served only under special circumstances. Prayer was constant. Guests described the mansion during Polk's tenure as austerely Protestant, politically exacting, and socially muted. He had chronic digestive issues, likely stress-induced, and adhered to a strict, bland diet, mostly boiled vegetables and soft bread. He believed seasoning dulled the senses. He avoided alcohol. He claimed it slowed his mind. On the rare occasions he did indulge, he took exactly 3 sips, not 2. Not 4. He had a deep fear of being misquoted. He rarely spoke off the cuff. When forced to give impromptu remarks, he spoke slowly, choosing every word as if it were a policy. He once spent an entire evening rewriting a 4-sentence thank you note to ensure the syntax implied humility but not weakness. One of the few personal indulgences he permitted was his belief in omen reading. He didn't speak of it publicly, but in private, he noted strange coincidences. An eagle circling twice, a broken clock restarting unprompted. He recorded them, dated them, interpreted them not as prophecy, but as subtle nudges toward caution or urgency. He called them the natural whisperings of conscience. He despised clutter. His desk contained only what he was working on at that moment. Papers were stacked precisely, pens aligned, inkwells at exact distance. He had drawers labeled not just by subject, but by tone, urgent, ambiguous, requiring soft reply. The man sorted emotions like files. Polk expanded the United States by over 1 million square miles. He oversaw the annexation of Texas, negotiated the Oregon boundary with Britain, and led the country into war with Mexico, controversial, bloody, and decisive. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. It was empire building disguised as manifest destiny. He kept the war plan secret from many of his advisors until it was nearly underway. He trusted almost no one fully. He believed politics was a game of attrition, and only the most precise survived. He micromanaged generals, personally reviewed battlefield reports, drew territorial lines himself, said once, "Every inch of the nation must be shaped by the executive hand." He left office, as promised, after one term, exhausted, gaunt, hollow-eyed. Observers said he looked 20 years older than when he took office. He traveled the South on a brief tour, trying to reconnect with private life. Smiled more, ate slightly better, laughed once. 3 months later, he was dead. Likely from cholera, possibly from overwork, certainly from exhaustion. He was 53. The youngest president to die until John F. Kennedy. His tomb bears his chosen epitaph. He said he would serve 4 years and accomplish what he set out to do. He did, and then he vanished from politics. No memoir, no comeback, no lingering, but the man who followed him would do exactly the opposite. Zachary Taylor, rough, gruff, adored by troops, and allergic to politics, a man who led from instinct, not ideology, and whose sudden death would spark more questions than his presidency ever answered. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor never intended to be president. He didn't seek power, didn't craft speeches, and didn't polish his image. He was a soldier. Rough, direct, indifferent to politics. His uniform was stained, his syntax tangled, and his appeal rooted not in charisma, but in reputation. They called him Old Rough and Ready. The name fit. He'd commanded troops for 40 years, fought in the War of 1812, led men through the swamps of Florida, and won major victories in the Mexican-American War. I barely understood Washington, but Washington, for a brief moment, belonged to him. He owned no political platform, belonged to no real faction, had never voted in a presidential election, not even for himself. Yet in 1848, the Whigs nominated him out of sheer pragmatism. He was a hero, a name, a symbol of stability. He accepted reluctantly. His letters during the campaign were sparse and oddly detached. When asked about policy, he replied that he would do what is just. When pressed further, he said, "The Constitution, sir, is my guide." He won. And he arrived in Washington with the gait of a man who would have rather been anywhere else. He wore civilian clothes, even when protocol demanded military dress, refused to sit for an official portrait during his first months in office. He claimed it wasted light and time. He hated pomp, refused a formal inaugural parade, delivered his speech in under 20 minutes, with a tone closer to a weather report than a mission statement. He preferred camp stools to leather chairs, lit his own fireplace, declined invitations to elite gatherings unless compelled. At his first formal dinner as president, he spilled gravy on his sleeve and continued the conversation without acknowledgement. He was utterly unfazed by ceremony. He ate like a soldier, cornmeal, pickled vegetables, and milk, lots of milk. He drank it daily, sometimes warm, sometimes sour, always with a stubborn confidence that it settled the blood. White House chefs complained of his taste for undercooked meat and overcooked beans. He refused anything French. Once said, "I've fought too many wars to eat like a Parisian." He believed in instincts, in the clarity of doing what feels right. He distrusted lawyers, detested long speeches, and once fell asleep during a cabinet presentation on tariffs. His view of leadership was battlefield-born. Act swiftly, trust your gut, and never flinch. He distrusted professional politicians, especially those who flattered. He kept his circle tight. Most of his letters from the presidency are devoid of emotion. He once wrote, the nation will do well if I do not get in its way. That was the closest he came to vision. And yet, for all his disinterest in ideology, Taylor held firm on the question of the Union. In the volatile storm of 1850, as Southern leaders began to threaten secession over the issue of slavery in new territories, Taylor shocked them. Though a Southerner himself and a slaveholder, he rejected the idea of expanding slavery through political force. He warned that if secession occurred, he would personally lead the army to put down the rebellion and hang those responsible as traitors. That statement rattled Washington. Taylor had barely uttered 50 words of policy during his first months. Now he was threatening to march on fellow Americans. And, unlike most politicians, he meant it. He died before the fight began. On July 4th, 1850, after attending a long Independence Day celebration in sweltering heat, he returned to the White House and consumed a meal of raw cherries, cold milk, and iced water. That night, he became violently ill. Over the next several days, his condition worsened. Fevers, cramps, dehydration, delirium. Doctors tried bleeding, opium, poultices. Nothing worked. He died 5 days later. The official cause was acute gastroenteritis, but for decades, rumors lingered. Poison, arsenic, a political hit. In 1991, his body was exhumed and tested. No significant poison was found, but the mystery endures. Some say the timing was too perfect. Others call it conspiracy nonsense. The truth remains entangled in speculation and rot. He served 492 days, the third shortest presidency in history. His most famous order had been a threat of civil war. His most lasting legacy was his death. And yet, in the void he left, compromise returned. For a while, Millard Fillmore stepped into office, a man polite, deliberate, and forgettable. But for the moment, the general was gone, and the presidency, once again, belonged to someone who had actually wanted the job. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore entered the presidency like a man stepping into a room he didn't decorate. He hadn't been elected to the job. He hadn't even been in the loop on key decisions. When Zachary Taylor died in 1850, Fillmore was suddenly president, not because anyone wanted him to be, but because the Constitution said so. The country didn't know what to expect, and for much of his term, neither did he. He was polite to the point of discomfort, reserved, deliberate, perpetually formal. His clothing was immaculate, pressed, subdued. He spoke with precision, avoiding contractions and slang. He often sounded like a man quoting a letter he'd just written. His detractors called him dull. His allies called him dependable. Neither description was entirely wrong, but beneath the neatly tied cravat and rehearsed smiles was a man full of contradictions. Fillmore was born in a log cabin. His family was poor, and his path to power was defined by upward clawing. Taylor's apprentice, law clerk, state legislator, he studied late at night, wrote essays in longhand, taught himself Latin. He believed deeply in self-made respectability. He carried a cane not for walking, but for balance during public addresses. He believed it made him look more symmetrical behind a podium. It was weighted at the bottom with a silver cap he polished nightly. He treated his appearance as an argument. Fillmore refused to install a bathtub in the White House. When a plumbing advocate attempted to persuade him, Fillmore reportedly replied, "The presidency is no place for indulgence." He believed water was for drinking, not soaking. He took sponge baths with vinegar and wore wool even in July. He thought sweating was a sign of discipline. He wrote in near calligraphic script, using an ivory-handled quill he cleaned with lemon oil. He signed his name the same way every time, no matter the document, bold capital M, elegant arc to the F. Even when signing an order for a military intervention, his handwriting looked like a wedding invitation. Fillmore had a curious habit of organizing his desk based on the mood of the day. If it was a difficult morning, he arranged his papers in descending stacks, from left to right. If he was feeling optimistic, he placed them in a single vertical pile. A tower of resolve, he once called it. Staff noticed the change in mood before he spoke a word. He kept a dictionary beside him at all times. He once paused a cabinet meeting to confirm the etymology of a word a general had used. When corrected, he didn't scold. He simply nodded and wrote the word on a note card, filing it in a box labeled imprecise language. His presidency was consumed by the Compromise of 1850, a bundle of 5 bills intended to diffuse sectional tensions between North and South. Taylor had opposed it. Fillmore embraced it. He believed compromise was salvation, not surrender. The most controversial of the 5 bills was the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens and local governments in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. Fillmore signed it into law. He didn't flinch. He called it necessary, said, "The Union must be preserved at all costs." Abolitionists were horrified. Riots broke out in northern cities. Fillmore insisted he was merely upholding the Constitution. He wrote a 12-page letter defending his decision. No speech, just a letter. It was distributed widely, full of legal reasoning, historical references, and rhetorical caution. It calmed no one. He distrusted emotional politics, believed that too much feeling diluted thought. He once said, "There is nothing more dangerous than a man who loves too loudly." That philosophy shaped his entire presidency and alienated almost everyone with a moral cause. He was, however, fascinated by innovation. He invited the first Japanese delegation to the United States, supported the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, approved funding for the Library of Congress to expand its holdings. He believed progress must be contained in books before it appeared in action. And yet, when he left his office in 1853, his own party had abandoned him. The Whigs didn't nominate him for re-election. They fractured instead, splintering into pieces that would later form the Republican Party. Fillmore ran again in 1856 on the nativist Know-Nothing ticket, opposing immigration and Catholic influence. It failed. He came in third. He faded from public life, tended to his garden, attended funerals, refused interviews. When asked late in life what he regretted, he said, "That which I did quietly may be misremembered loudly." He died in 1874. His final words were reportedly, "The nourishment is palatable," spoken after eating a spoonful of soup. He left behind no scandal, no war, no great speech, just quiet decisions and their echoes. And the man who came after him was louder, more theatrical, and far stranger, Franklin Pierce, a man elected to unite a broken country, only to watch it fall further apart, under the weight of both politics and personal grief. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce looked like a president, tall, handsome, finely dressed, with a speaking voice that could lull even hostile crowds into something close to interest. But that surface calm concealed a man racked with contradiction, charming, yet profoundly melancholic, eloquent, yet evasive, elevated to the highest office in the land, yet seemingly unable to rise to the moment. He was called Handsome Frank by admirers and critics alike, a title that followed him like a shadow. His hair was always perfect, dark, wavy, carefully arranged. He polished his boots every morning, not out of vanity but order. He believed messiness was a symptom of weakness, but his life was shaped by tragedy, and his presidency came wrapped in grief. Just weeks before he took office in 1853, Pierce, his wife Jane, and their 11-year-old son Benjamin were traveling by train when the car derailed and rolled off the tracks. Pierce and Jane survived with minor injuries. Benjamin was thrown from the train and killed instantly, his body crushed in front of them. Pierce never recovered. Jane, already fragile and withdrawn, went into a near catatonic mourning. She believed the accident was divine punishment for her husband's ambition. She refused to attend the inauguration. She wore black every day of his presidency. For months, she refused to speak aloud. Instead, she wrote letters to her dead son, which she left in the White House bedroom they had prepared for him. Pierce was sworn in without her, without joy, without prayer. He declined to use a Bible. He gave his inaugural address from memory. His voice was steady. His eyes were hollow. He governed like a man trying not to break in public. He avoided emotional language in speeches, preferring constitutional formalism. But the contradictions mounted quickly. He was a Northerner who supported Southern interests. He believed in federal authority but backed the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. He spoke of unity while reinforcing division. Each decision widened the wound. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise and allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. The result was chaos. Bleeding Kansas erupted into violence. Mobs, raids, murders. Pierce condemned the violence, but did nothing meaningful to stop it. He called abolitionist movements a threat to order. Critics called him a Southern puppet. He wrote his vetoes in longhand, preferring fountain pens with slightly bent nibs. He claimed the angle helped him write straighter. Every veto was edited 3 times. once for language, once for rhythm, once for resonance, as he put it. He considered political language to be a matter of tuning, not shouting. He believed in decorum to the point of obsession. He once delayed a diplomatic meeting by 30 minutes because the visiting ambassador's boots were unpolished. He kept notes on posture, handshake strength, and table etiquette for guests. He had a chair removed from the Oval Office because it creaked during meetings. Despite his cold public image, Pierce was sociable in private. He enjoyed conversation, preferred cigars to wine, and had a deep theatrical laugh. Rarely heard in public, but unforgettable when it surfaced. He loved telling stories from his days as a brigadier general in the Mexican-American War, though he often glossed over the part where he fainted during battle and was injured when his horse fell on him. He kept a pocket watch engraved with his son's initials, touched it before every major decision, sometimes whispered to it when he thought no one was around. He hated speeches that mentioned God. Not out of atheism, he was deeply spiritual, but because he believed God should not be invoked for earthly errors. He once told a chaplain, "The Almighty is not a co-signer to our legislation." He had a complicated relationship with alcohol. He was known to drink heavily at times, but denied having a problem. Rumors swirled throughout his presidency. He brushed them off. After leaving office, the rumors intensified. Historians believe he struggled with addiction for much of his adult life. When confronted by an old friend about his drinking, Pierce reportedly replied, "There's nothing left to intoxicate." He was the first president to install a Christmas tree in the White House. A small, sparse fir, no candles, just ribbons. He sat beside it for hours alone on Christmas Eve, according to staff. No guests were invited that year. His foreign policy was active, even aggressive. He sought to expand American influence into Central America and the Caribbean. He authorized the Ostend Manifesto, a proposal to purchase, or if necessary seize, Cuba from Spain. When the proposal leaked, it caused a scandal. Pierce denied involvement, but the damage was done. By the end of his term, his party had abandoned him. He was not renominated. He left office isolated, unpopular, and physically deteriorated. When asked how he felt about leaving the White House, he said, "There's nothing left but to go home and prepare to die." He lived for another 15 years, but never returned to public life. He wrote long letters to no one in particular, walked alone in the rain, spoke of his son often, drank more. His final words, reportedly spoken to a priest, were, "Don't let them make me a villain. I was only trying to hold things together." And then he was gone, and the presidency passed to a man with a beard before Lincoln made it fashionable, James Buchanan. A lifelong bachelor, a lifelong equivocator, and a man whose greatest legacy would be doing nothing at all while everything fell apart. James Buchanan. James Buchanan was a man of impeccable manners, vast legal knowledge, and infinite hesitation. He entered the presidency in 1857 with the calm confidence of a man who had waited a lifetime for the job and governed with the bewildering passivity of someone who never knew what to do with it. He was the only U.S. president who never married. The reasons remain ambiguous. Some historians speculate on a lost love, others hint at deeper complexities. What is known is that he lived for years with Alabama Senator William Rufus King, whom Andrew Jackson nicknamed Miss Nancy. Washington insiders called them the Siamese twins, a label Buchanan never disputed. The correspondence between the two men was destroyed by family members after Buchanan's death, and whatever truth lay in that domestic arrangement died with them. He was formal to the point of parody, always dressed in full suit, even in private, never removed his jacket in the Oval Office, ate with gloved hands at dinner, signed documents with a heavy silver pen he kept in a velvet pouch. His writing was large and looping, decided, elegant, and occasionally overwritten. He rewrote letters 5 times before sending them. He once said, "A misplaced comma may collapse a century." He had a glass eye. Most people didn't know. It was his left. He had lost vision in that eye during a bout of mercury poisoning in his youth, and the resulting inflammation permanently damaged it. The glass eye was so meticulously matched to his real one that even close friends couldn't tell. He had it adjusted monthly by a specialist in Philadelphia. Buchanan was obsessed with etiquette. He kept a book of social rules on his desk and often cited it during meetings. He believed small talk was a diplomatic tool and could spend entire evenings discussing table placement. His state dinners were famous for their rigidity. 9 courses, no laughter, no improvisation. Guests were assigned seats based on an arcane hierarchy known only to Buchanan and his chief usher. He spoke slowly and precisely, often pausing mid-sentence to choose the cleanest possible word. Reporters noted that he sounded like a man translating his thoughts from Latin, even when discussing coal tariffs. Despite his political experience, senator, secretary of state, minister to Russia and Britain, he was catastrophically unprepared for the crisis he inherited. As Southern states began to secede in the wake of Abraham Lincoln's election, Buchanan's response was paralysis. He insisted that states did not have the right to secede, then claimed the federal government had no authority to stop them. It was constitutional schizophrenia. He sent mixed signals to the South, ambiguous letters to Congress, and long circular statements to the press. He hoped the problem would resolve itself. It didn't. By the time he left office, 7 states had seceded. The Confederacy had formed. Fort Sumter was surrounded. He did nothing. His detractors accused him of sympathizing with the South. His defenders said he was trying to prevent war. The truth may be that Buchanan believed the Constitution was too delicate to withstand aggressive action. He worshipped process over principle. He said, "My duty is to the law, not to events." It was a noble-sounding abdication. He slept on the same side of the bed every night, wore a black ribbon around his neck that he called his thinking line, and insisted on being shaved by the same barber who had served him for 30 years. He trusted almost no one, and made even fewer decisions. He claimed to read the Bible nightly, but was never seen with one. He kept his late housekeeper's portrait in his bedroom and spoke to it before bedtime. Once a maid heard him say, "You still understand me better than Congress." He consumed vast quantities of food, often more than a dozen eggs per week, and entire loaves of bread in a day. He washed it down with sherry or Madeira, which he sipped constantly. He believed wine smoothed deliberation. He was the last president to wear formal knee breeches to public events. And when his term ended in 1861, he left Washington under armed escort. Angry crowds had gathered. He handed the presidency to Abraham Lincoln and told a reporter, "If you are as happy entering the presidency as I am leaving it, you are a very happy man." He returned to his estate, Wheatland, in Pennsylvania, and spent the remaining years of his life writing a defense of his presidency. It was nearly 300 pages long. No one read it. He died in 1868, isolated, widely blamed for the war, and largely forgotten outside of history books. His tombstone makes no mention of the presidency. And then came Lincoln, a man with no social polish, no patience for hierarchy, and no tolerance for passivity, a man whose arrival marked the death of one nation and the birth of another. Abraham Lincoln. He arrived in Washington with a beard grown at a young girl's suggestion and a suitcase full of unfinished thoughts. Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter, the lawyer, the long-shot candidate from Illinois, stood over 6 feet tall but carried the weight of a century on his back. He walked like a man who already knew how the story would end, and governed like someone determined to make each chapter count anyway. He was not polished. He wasn't from money. He didn't read Latin, and his manners were awkward. At formal dinners, he sometimes forgot utensils. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He stood when he didn't need to, but what he lacked in etiquette, he replaced with a kind of moral gravity. He didn't dominate rooms. He altered their temperature. He read Shakespeare aloud to calm himself, often Macbeth or Hamlet, the darker plays. He quoted them in meetings, sometimes to the confusion of his cabinet. One witness described him reading the "Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow" soliloquy softly by a window during the bloodiest months of the war. Not performing, just reciting. He often held his own hand while thinking, left thumb over right, fingers curled, arms folded across his chest like a binding ritual. When nervous, he would tug on his beard, chew his lip, or wander the halls of the White House barefoot. Staff grew used to the sound of him pacing at odd hours, whispering half-sentences into the night air. He hated being photographed, but tolerated it. He understood the image mattered. He knew he didn't look presidential by the standards of his day. Too angular, too unkempt, too sad. But in time, that sadness became the nation's mirror. He believed in humor, but used it like a scalpel. Sharp, unexpected, often disarming. During a particularly tense cabinet meeting, when accused of telling jokes too often amid crisis, he replied, "If I did not laugh, I should die. And you need me to stay alive." His stovepipe hat, always present, wasn't just for show. He used it as a filing cabinet, literally. He stored letters, notes, even legal briefs inside the crown. It was a walking archive. On at least one occasion, he pulled out a speech from it mid-train ride and edited it on his knee with a borrowed pencil. He was fascinated by mechanics. He once attempted to patent a device for lifting boats over shoals. It failed, but he remains the only U.S. president to hold a patent. He also fixed clocks, rewound watches, and took apart doorknobs just to see how they worked. The gears, he said, reminded him of language, simple things turning complex results. He often wrote with his legs stretched out and his paper resting on his thighs. His handwriting was narrow, slanted, and at times barely legible. His letters were peppered with ellipses, as though his thoughts drifted faster than ink could keep up. Lincoln rarely raised his voice. In fact, during speeches, he often began too softly for the audience to hear. Then, word by word, he gathered them. Not by volume, by cadence. He didn't roar, he summoned. And the words he summoned changed the country. The Emancipation Proclamation was not delivered with fanfare. It was written slowly, carefully, and with full awareness that it would shake the nation's foundation. It didn't free all slaves, but it cracked the institution open and forced the country to look directly into the gap between its values and its laws. Lincoln didn't love war, but he accepted it. His writings from that period, private, terse, show a man who bore each casualty personally. He received casualty reports daily, sometimes hourly. He read them all. He visited hospitals frequently, sometimes alone, shaking hands with wounded soldiers, listening without interrupting. He carried candy for young patients, memorized names of amputees, and whispered encouragements that no one else heard. He rarely smiled in photographs, but in those rooms he did. He wept in private, never in public. He believed dreams carried meaning. He once dreamed of a ship sailing into a dark shore, silent and heavy. He told Mary about it the week before his assassination. And then there was the theater. April 14, 1865. He went reluctantly. He always did. The play was Our American Cousin. The crowd, enthusiastic. The box seat, decorated. John Wilkes Booth entered quietly, fired once, and fled into legend. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House. He lingered overnight, unconscious, surrounded by cabinet members, doctors, and soldiers. He died the next morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton closed his eyes and said, "Now he belongs to the ages," but he belonged to something else too. Something quieter. He belonged to the American conscience. And after him came a man unequipped for the aftermath. A tailor from Tennessee. A Southerner who stayed with the Union but never truly understood its soul. Andrew Johnson, the man who tried to carry on Lincoln's work and nearly lost the country in the process. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson took the oath of office with one hand on a Bible and the other still shaking. It was the morning after Lincoln's assassination. The country was in mourning. The Union was fragile. And the presidency had fallen into the hands of a man most Americans had barely heard speak. He wasn't a war hero. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a polished orator. He was a tailor, a backroom debater, a Southerner who stayed loyal to the Union, and a president who would nearly be torn apart by the very country he tried to reunite. Born in a North Carolina log cabin to illiterate parents, Johnson never attended school. He taught himself to read as a teenager, apprenticed under a tailor, opened a shop, listened to political arguments as he stitched coats, then slowly began making arguments of his own. He entered politics through rhetoric, not resume. People said he had a gift for speaking directly, sometimes too directly. By the time he became Abraham Lincoln's running mate in 1864, he was a controversial figure, a Democrat on a Republican ticket, a slaveholder turned Unionist, a Southern defender of the North. The idea was to promote national unity. What it created was a presidency full of fracture. At Lincoln's second inauguration, Johnson, who had been drinking heavily to calm a fever, gave a rambling, nearly incoherent speech in the Senate chamber. He shouted about traitors, repeated himself, lost track of his sentences. Lincoln looked on silently. Witnesses described the event as embarrassing, disastrous, and prophetic. One senator leaned over and whispered, "This is the man who will be president if Lincoln dies." 6 weeks later, he was. Johnson entered the White House during one of the most delicate transitions in American history. The Civil War was over. The South was devastated. Millions of formerly enslaved people awaited freedom, justice, and protection. Reconstruction had begun, and Johnson would quickly define and derail its course. He believed in the Constitution above all else, but his interpretation of it was rigid, personal, and deeply tied to states' rights. He opposed secession but believed the Southern states had never truly left the Union. Therefore, in his mind, they required no congressional oversight for re-entry. He began pardoning former Confederate leaders, returning property, and restoring political power to many who had, just weeks earlier, been at war with the United States. Congress was stunned. Radical Republicans had envisioned Reconstruction as a transformation of the South, a rebirth of the nation's founding ideals, including full citizenship for formerly enslaved people. Johnson believed such efforts were federal overreach. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, then the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Congress overrode both vetoes, the first time in U.S. history that major legislation passed over a president's objections. Johnson's speeches turned combative. He toured the country by train in what he called a swing around the circle, a kind of early campaign-style public outreach, but instead of winning hearts, he alienated nearly everyone. He heckled crowds, compared himself to Jesus, accused Congress of conspiracy. At one stop, someone threw a rotten egg at him. He ducked, kept speaking. He wrote long letters to newspapers defending his decisions, usually late at night, sometimes in response to anonymous editorials. He took criticism personally. He once ordered the arrest of a man who insulted him in print. He was overruled. Johnson rarely smiled, refused to shake hands with members of Congress he disliked, kept 2 copies of the Constitution in his desk drawer, one to read, one to underline furiously when angry. His annotations survive today, full of capital letters, exclamation points, and marginal warnings like misinterpreted, intended for states. He believed he was saving the Union. Most of Congress believed he was dismantling it. In 1868, the House of Representatives impeached him, the first time a U.S. president had ever faced removal from office. The charge, violation of the Tenure of Office Act, for attempting to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without Senate approval. But behind the legal pretext lay a deeper conflict. The future of Reconstruction, the limits of executive power, and Johnson's increasingly erratic leadership. The Senate held the trial. Johnson sat in the White House isolated, writing speeches he never gave. The vote came down to a single ballot. He survived by 1 vote. Weakened, bitter, but still president, he limped to the end of his term. He was denied the nomination for a second term. His final acts in office were quiet, procedural, devoid of flourish. He returned to Tennessee, where he eventually ran again for Senate and won, the only president to do so. But even in victory, he seemed unfinished. He died shortly thereafter. His tomb bears a peculiar sight, his body wrapped in an American flag, his head resting on a copy of the Constitution. His legacy remains tangled. He kept the Union intact, but weakened the moral momentum of Reconstruction. He fought for constitutional limits, but ignored human urgency. He opposed slavery, but empowered the very forces that would resurrect its social foundations. And after him came a general, a man of silence, not speeches, Ulysses S. Grant, the warrior president, who would try to govern a country still at war with itself. Only now, without uniforms. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant entered the presidency the way most men would exit a war, tired, skeptical, and still listening for echoes of artillery. He had won the Civil War not with eloquence, but with endurance, quiet, stubborn, and methodical. Grant had crushed the Confederacy with a kind of detached resolve that unnerved his enemies and occasionally his allies. He wasn't loud, he wasn't charismatic, he was steady, and the country, bleeding from years of division, handed him the White House like a bandage. He wasn't a politician. He said so himself. "I know only 2 tunes," he once admitted. "One is Yankee Doodle, and the other isn't." He rarely spoke more than was necessary, avoided exaggeration, and met praise with silence. Yet his life was full of strange, unexplained tics and ironies that clung to him long after the battles ended. Grant was terrified of blood. During the war, he avoided field hospitals. He couldn't bear the smell. He rarely watched amputations and preferred battle maps to battlefield carnage. Yet he wrote orders for campaigns that caused more casualties than any general before him. He understood war as arithmetic, loss subtracted from momentum until someone surrendered. He smoked constantly. By the end of the Civil War, he was reportedly consuming up to 20 cigars a day. His breath always smelled of ash. His fingers were permanently stained. When a newspaper published a story about his cigar habit, fans sent him boxes of them. Tens of thousands. He kept them stacked in the White House basement. Staff claimed the walls smelled of tobacco for years after his presidency. He was painfully shy. He hated public speaking and wrote his inaugural address in a tone so restrained it read more like a train schedule than a declaration. He read it quickly, barely pausing between paragraphs. Yet, he commanded armies of hundreds of thousands without flinching. He had a famously bad poker face. During negotiations, generals learned to watch his boots, not his mouth. His leg would twitch when annoyed. He kept his hat low over his eyes and mumbled during major decisions. But once a decision was made, he did not revisit it. His will was quiet, but immovable. He hated uniforms. During the war, he often wore a private's coat with only the smallest insignia to denote rank. He preferred mud to polish, practicality to pageantry. As president, he sometimes arrived at events in clothes better suited to riding. Etiquette bored him. Grant once received a speeding ticket on horseback. In Washington, D.C., he was stopped for riding too fast in the city streets. The officer didn't realize who he was. Grant paid the fine without argument. He later said, "The law is the law." His presidency was marked by contradiction, personally honest, yet surrounded by scandal. Grant himself never took a bribe, never enriched himself, never once dipped his fingers into the till. But his administration became a hive of corruption. The credit mobilier scandal, the whiskey ring, crony appointments. Grant, loyal to a fault, refused to believe his friends were thieves. He protected them even as the newspapers burned him for it. He was colorblind. Red and green confused him. In an era where military maps were coded by color, this became a quiet problem. Aides would label maps with letters and textures to help him navigate. He never complained, just squinted harder. He loved horses, not just as machines of war, but as personalities. He was a master rider, calm even with the wildest stallions. He could tame a horse in minutes, often with a quiet voice and soft hands. One observer said, "He never broke them, he taught them." He was generous to a fault. He gave away money to friends, loans to acquaintances, and jobs to men who barely earned them. After leaving the presidency, he trusted a financier named Ferdinand Ward to invest his savings. Ward turned out to be a con man. Grant lost everything. He wrote his memoirs while dying of throat cancer. Penniless, in pain, unable to swallow, he sat wrapped in blankets, coughing between sentences. He wrote with urgency, knowing it was the only legacy he could leave for his wife Julia and their children. The result was a 2-volume masterpiece, still considered one of the greatest works of presidential prose. He finished the last page just days before he died. The ink was still drying when the cancer finally silenced him. Mark Twain, who had helped publish the memoirs, ensured that Grant's family would be financially secure. Grant was buried in New York City, under a monument larger than any built for a U.S. president. Tens of thousands attended his funeral. Many were veterans, both Union and Confederate. He had once said, "Let us have peace." They came to honor the one man who, with quiet determination, had tried to keep that promise, and after Grant came a very different man. A talker, a deal maker, a president who'd once lived in a log cabin shaped like a question mark. Rutherford Burchard Hayes, the man who lost the popular vote, won the presidency, and tiptoed through a national compromise that never fully healed. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford Burchard Hayes became president by negotiation, not by vote. The 1876 election was one of the most disputed in American history. He lost the popular vote. The electoral vote was contested in 3 southern states. For months, the country teetered on the brink of political breakdown. Ballots were counted, recounted, contested, argued in courtrooms and newspapers. When the dust settled, through backroom deals, secret promises, and the infamous compromise of 1877, Hayes emerged the victor. He took the oath of office in a secret ceremony under cover of night, 2 days before Inauguration Day, just in case his opponents tried to stop him. No fanfare, no crowds, just whispered legitimacy. He called it a second birth of quiet government. Critics called it theft. Hayes was a man of conflicting instincts, reform-minded but cautious, moralistic but politically pragmatic. He was intensely disciplined, woke up at dawn, read 3 newspapers before breakfast, exercised daily, kept a journal obsessively, recording his thoughts, his schedule, even the tone of his dreams. His handwriting was neat, looping, and almost painfully exact. Even his private reflections read like a committee summary. He believed deeply in the civil service. He hated the spoil system, the practice of handing out government jobs as political favors. His first battle as president was not over war or the economy, but over patronage. He fired powerful New York customs officials tied to Senator Roscoe Conkling, one of the era's political titans. It was bold. It was unpopular. But Hayes didn't blink. He banned alcohol from the White House. His wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, became known as Lemonade Lucy, not because she insisted, she didn't, but because Hayes believed the White House should model temperance. State dinners were dry. Foreign dignitaries were quietly furious. Wine bottles were removed and replaced with pitchers of fruit punch. Hayes shrugged. Virtue, he said, is its own toast. He had a photographic memory. He could recall speeches verbatim, pages of legislation word for word, and had a near-perfect recall of names. He used it strategically, disarming opponents by remembering obscure facts about their districts, their ancestors, or a speech they gave 3 years prior. Hayes kept a pet goat named Old Whiskers on the White House lawn. The goat was allowed to roam freely and once dragged the president's youngest son down Pennsylvania Avenue in a child's cart. Hayes laughed. The press did not. He refused to campaign for re-election, keeping his promise that he would serve only 1 term. But during his presidency, he traveled extensively, more than any president before him. He believed in seeing the country firsthand. He took trains through the South, gave speeches in small towns, shook thousands of hands. He believed presence mattered. Words could be printed, he said, but a handshake is a sentence of its own. His greatest and most controversial act was the formal end of Reconstruction. As part of the 1877 compromise that secured his presidency, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. With them went the last protections for black voters and newly freed communities. The southern states quickly passed Jim Crow laws, rolled back civil rights, and began a new era of systemic repression. Hayes insisted the withdrawal would lead to local control, not oppression. History proved otherwise. For decades, Black Americans in the South would suffer under laws and violence that stemmed, in part, from that decision. He knew it too. In his journals, he wrote, "It is a cruel choice to preserve the peace of the whole by risking the justice of the few." It haunted him. He spoke often of justice, less often of power. He was fascinated by technology, installed the first typewriter in the White House, attended early phonograph demonstration, advocated for education reform with the energy of a school teacher. He believed the future would be built by engineers, not politicians. His speeches were long and wooden, earnest, overloaded with clauses, cautious to a fault. He often edited them with a red pencil, noting in margins, too passionate, too direct, or tone too sharp. He distrusted emotional appeals, preferred reason, even if it bored the audience. He owned dozens of canes, each from a different state. He labeled them by date and material. He once brought a cane made of petrified wood to a cabinet meeting and said, "It reminds me to outlast what troubles me." He retired quietly to his Ohio home, Spiegel Grove, and spent his final years supporting education for black children, prison reform, and universal suffrage. He gave lectures, wrote essays, outlived many of his critics. When he died in 1893, his last words were, "I know that I'm going where Lucy is." They were buried side by side, and after Hayes came a man with mutton chops, encyclopedic memory, and the calm of a librarian in the middle of a storm. James A. Garfield, a reluctant president, a reformer by instinct, and a man whose term would be cut short by the barrel of a stranger's gun. James A. Garfield? James A. Garfield never really wanted to be president, not because he wasn't capable. He was. In fact, he might have been one of the most intellectually gifted men to ever hold the office. But politics, for Garfield, was more accident than ambition. He had served in Congress for nearly 2 decades, known as a thoughtful debater, a moderate reformer, and a man whose mind moved faster than his party. He was nominated at the 1880 Republican National Convention, not as a frontrunner or even as a candidate, but as a compromise. The convention had deadlocked, factions collided, and then unexpectedly, delegates began chanting his name. Garfield reportedly cried when he realized what was happening. He won the election, narrowly, and 200 days later, he was dead. But in those 200 days, the nation witnessed a president of peculiar brilliance, private habits, and a fate that remains one of the strangest in American political history. Garfield grew up poor, born in a log cabin in Ohio. His father died when he was 2. He worked as a janitor at his college to pay tuition, became a professor by age 26, then the college president, then a Union general, then a congressman. He read ancient Greek for fun, translated Latin on the fly. He was ambidextrous and could allegedly write in Greek with one hand and Latin with the other, simultaneously. He didn't like confrontation, but he excelled in debate. He once said, "I hate war, but I love a good argument." He often settled policy disputes by quoting Shakespeare or Euclid. He saw logic as the foundation of public life. He kept a small chalkboard in his office, drew mathematical diagrams during meetings, calculated budget margins in the margins of speeches. When the press asked what the board was for, he replied, "To see the truth before speaking it." He had a naturally kind demeanor, but he also had trouble saying no. He was swamped with visitors, favors, and requests. Friends worried about his inability to turn people away. He just smiled and said, "Every handshake is a vote of faith." His beard was thick, pointed, and constantly trimmed. He did it himself, using scissors he kept in a pouch attached to his desk. He once joked, "A man without a beard is like a lion without a mane." But behind the humor was routine. Every morning began with tea, toast, and beard maintenance. He believed facial hair reflected inner order. He loved his family, wrote daily letters to his wife Lucretia, played with his children on the White House lawn, often in plain sight of the press. He hated pretension and refused to fence off the grounds. When advised to install guards, he said, "If the people want to visit, let them." Garfield was an early advocate for civil service reform. He opposed the spoils system that plagued Washington, politicians handing out government jobs in exchange for loyalty. He wanted merit-based appointments. It made him enemies. One of them was Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau was a failed lawyer, failed preacher, and delusional political hanger-on. He believed he had helped Garfield win the presidency. He hadn't, and expected a diplomatic post as a reward. When he was denied, repeatedly he began stalking the president, wrote letters, waited outside meetings. His requests turned into threats. On July 2nd, 1881, in a train station in Washington, Guiteau approached Garfield from behind and shot him twice. Once in the arm, once in the back. Garfield collapsed. He didn't die immediately. In fact, he lingered for 79 days. What followed was a slow-motion tragedy shaped less by the bullet than by medical incompetence. Doctors probed the wound with unwashed hands. One used a finger, another a brass instrument. The bullet couldn't be found. Garfield developed infection after infection. His condition worsened not because of the shooting, but because of the treatment. Alexander Graham Bell tried to locate the bullet using a metal detector of his own invention, but it was thrown off by the metal bed springs. Garfield suffered in silence. He wasted away in a hot, fetid bedroom, sweating through the summer while doctors argued over drainage methods. His weight dropped dramatically. His voice weakened. He dictated letters and tried to follow news reports, but his world was shrinking. He died on September 19th, 1881. The cause: infection, blood poisoning, and exhaustion. Had he received modern care, he almost certainly would have survived. Guiteau was arrested and executed, but never truly understood his crime. He claimed divine inspiration. He declared himself a martyr. During his trial, he composed poems. He smiled at his own hanging. Garfield was mourned deeply, not just for his death, but for the promise that died with him. He had shown signs of becoming a rare president, intellectual but empathetic, ambitious but moderate, moral but not moralizing. He was buried in Cleveland. His funeral was attended by thousands. His body lies beneath a towering monument, larger than most remember, grander than his presidency ever had time to become. and in his place stepped Chester Alan Arthur, a man known for luxury, a product of the spoils system, and the last person anyone expected to care about reform until, inexplicably, he did. Chester A. Arthur. No one expected Chester Alan Arthur to become president. Not even Chester Alan Arthur. He was a party man, a sharp dresser, a New York insider who'd built his career under the oily umbrella of political patronage. He had never been elected to public office before becoming vice president. And when James Garfield was assassinated, Arthur ascended to the presidency with a national reputation for vanity, corruption, and little else. He was considered at best ornamental, at worst dangerous. Even Garfield's closest allies feared what might come next. And yet something changed. Arthur entered the White House in mourning, not celebration. He wept when he was sworn in. He visited Garfield's grave in secret, and then slowly he began to shed the skin of the man everyone thought he was. But before the transformation came the oddities, the details that made Arthur one of the most quietly bizarre presidents in history. He owned more than 80 pairs of pants. Not trousers, not suits. Pants, each tailored, pressed, and categorized by occasion. He changed outfits multiple times a day. Aides kept a rolling rack in his bedroom. At night, he walked the halls in silk robes, humming operatic tunes and trailing the scent of lilac water. He imported fresh flowers daily, slept with windows open year-round. He claimed the night air kept the lungs honest. White House staff detested it, especially in winter. Arthur redesigned the White House interior. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany, the famed glassmaker, to revamp the East Room. Walls were repainted in pastels. Chandeliers dripped in crystal. He auctioned off dozens of old furnishings, items dating back to Monroe and Jackson, without ceremony. When historians complained, he shrugged. "We are not a museum." He was nocturnal, began his workday around 10 a.m., but came alive after dusk. Cabinet meetings were scheduled late. He dined at 8, walked the halls until midnight, and often made decisions in the small hours, cigar in hand. Some nights, he played piano until 3 a.m. He rarely wrote anything down. Most of his decisions were delivered verbally, in soft tones, with minimal explanation. He believed the act of writing gave opponents ammunition. He once told a reporter, "Ink is a trap." Arthur had been deeply entrenched in the spoils system as a former collector of the Port of New York, a job he used to reward allies and entrench power. But after Garfield's assassination, he began to see the system as poison. Reformers scoffed. They didn't believe him. Then he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It created a merit-based system for federal employment, established competitive exams, and banned the solicitation of campaign contributions from government workers. It was a revolution in silence. No speeches, no fanfare, just ink and resolve. Old allies turned on him. Stalwarts, once his political home, called him a traitor. He let them go. He began refusing appointments he once would have handed out like party favors. He reshaped the federal workforce. He became respectable. And yet his health was failing. Unbeknownst to the public, Arthur had Bright's disease, a chronic kidney disorder. He was in near constant pain. His legs swelled. His appetite waned. He never spoke of it publicly, never complained. But the pace of his work slowed. His weight dropped. He took long retreats to the Adirondacks, pretending they were for leisure. In truth, they were escapes from exhaustion. He carried a handkerchief embroidered with his late wife's initials. Ellen had died of pneumonia in 1880. Arthur kept her portrait above his bed, whispered to it nightly, and never remarried. When questioned about his bachelorhood, he said, "My heart is still occupied." He loved oysters, consumed them by the dozen, preferred them raw with lemon and silence. He also developed a passion for fine wines. His cellar rivaled those of European embassies. He threw lavish dinners, but kept conversation formal. Jokes were permitted, but only at the table, never in policy discussions. He commissioned a custom desk with a secret compartment. Inside, he kept folded letters of resignation, pre-written, for every cabinet member. They were never used, but their presence was known. He believed it reminded them who was president. He refused to run for re-election. Though his popularity had grown and reformers had begun to warm to him, Arthur knew his body would not endure another term. He didn't say this aloud. He just stepped aside. His farewell address was quiet. "I have done my duty," he said. Others will judge its merit. He retired to New York, walked slowly, smiled less, burned most of his personal papers before he died. Nearly all of them. The nation has its version of me, he said. Let it be enough. He died in 1886 at 57, and the man who followed him would do everything Arthur refused to do. Stephen Grover Cleveland, blunt, earthy, twice elected and separated by defeat. The only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and a man who vanished from the public eye one summer, only to return missing part of his face. Grover Cleveland didn't want to be liked. He wanted to be right, large, serious, and blunt to the point of discomfort. He approached the presidency like a judge presiding over a trial he never asked to hear. He refused to smile for portraits. He rarely told jokes, and he entered the White House with a mantra that would echo throughout his 2 non-consecutive terms: tell the truth and let the nation take it as it will. He was the only U.S. president to serve 2 terms that weren't back-to-back. He was elected in 1884, lost in 1888, and came back in 1892, as if summoned by a country not quite done arguing with him. He had a strange relationship with power. He didn't crave it, but he didn't hide from it either. As mayor of Buffalo, he once vetoed an entire city budget because it included a $500 bribe disguised as a maintenance fee. When told he might lose support, he said, better to lose the vote than keep the stink. His personal habits were unvarnished. He was a man of appetites. He consumed steak like medicine, drank beer like water, and kept a cigar clenched in his teeth so often that it left a permanent impression on his molars. He weighed over 250 pounds and refused to wear corsets, waist trimmers, or any of the era's fashion corrections. When a tailor suggested refining his silhouette, Cleveland replied, "My shape is honest." He walked with a purpose, short, deliberate strides. Every morning began with a shave, a bath, and 2 boiled eggs. He wrote longhand with a fountain pen that leaked. His desk was always cluttered. He insisted this was a sign of activity, not disorder. An empty desk, he once said, means an idle man. He had a fearsome memory. He could recall the contents of specific legislative bills from decades prior, complete with page numbers. He once corrected a senator on a quotation from a tariff law, then cited the exact margin note from the congressional record. And then there was the summer of 1893, the cancer, the secret, and the surgery. Halfway into his second term, Cleveland noticed a rough spot on the roof of his mouth. Doctors confirmed his fear, a tumor, aggressive and potentially fatal. But the country was already in economic freefall, banks failing, unemployment rising. News of a sick president might spark panic. So he lied. Publicly, Cleveland announced he would be taking a short fishing trip aboard a friend's yacht, the Oneida. Privately, the yacht was converted into a floating surgical theater. With shades drawn and a doctor disguised as a guest, the president underwent a harrowing procedure as the boat cruised the East River. Surgeons removed nearly the entire left side of his upper jaw, along with part of his soft palate. The operation was done entirely through his mouth to avoid external scarring. No anesthesia, just ether and courage. His face was reconstructed with a rubber prosthetic. His speech, slightly slurred but intact. When he returned days later, the press saw only a president looking tired, not reconstructed. The secret held for years. Cleveland resumed work as if nothing had happened. He believed in limited government, vetoed more bills than any president before him, refused to give federal aid to victims of a drought in Texas, saying, "Though the people support the government should not support the people." It was cruel to some, principled to others. He hated waste, would return unopened gifts. He canceled White House ornament orders. Staff often bought decorations with their own money. He once removed a chandelier himself because it made the dining room feel insincere. He married while in office, becoming the only president to wed in the White House. Frances Folsom was 21 years old. He was 49. She had been his ward after her father died, and the marriage was both romanticized and scandalized in the press. Frances quickly became a sensation. Cleveland, gruff as ever, watched her popularity rise with a kind of bemused pride. He had 5 children and doted on them in a way that shocked those who saw his public stoicism. He played on the floor, let them climb on his lap during meetings, kept drawings on his desk, even during cabinet discussions. He ran his second term under the shadow of the panic of 1893. The economy crashed. Labor strikes erupted. He called in federal troops to break the Pullman strike, arguing that mail delivery was being obstructed. His decision split his party. Unions despised him. Business elites praised him. Cleveland didn't blink. He left office exhausted. His final words to his cabinet: "We try to do right." He retired to Princeton, New Jersey. Refused interviews. Wrote occasionally. Gardened poorly. He died in 1908. His last words, reportedly whispered to a nurse, were, "I have tried so hard to do right." He is remembered as a president who rarely smiled, often said no, and governed like a father with a firm hand and little time for excuses. And the man who followed him, briefly, reluctantly, and in many ways invisibly, was a placeholder from the battlefield, not the ballot box. Benjamin Harrison, a grandson of a president, a man with electricity in the White House but not much spark in his speeches, and a leader more comfortable in courtrooms than crowds. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison didn't command a room. He corrected it. Compact, bearded, and constantly buttoned. He was often mistaken for a clerk until he opened his mouth and delivered sentences so lawyerly they sounded like footnotes. He stood just over 5 feet 6 inches tall and rarely smiled unless prompted. His grandfather had been president, William Henry Harrison, the man who died after 31 days in office. Benjamin lasted longer, but not much louder. He came into office in 1889 after defeating Grover Cleveland, then lost to him again 4 years later, making Harrison the silent middle act in America's only non-consecutive presidential trilogy. But in those 4 years, Harrison built a record filled with ambition, contradiction, and strange quiet habits that made him one of the more unusual presidents of the late 19th century. He was known as the human iceberg. The nickname came not from any meanness. He was not cruel, but from his distance. He kept conversations short, never lingered after dinners, and preferred monologues to dialogues. Guests said talking to him was like presenting a case before a statue. One senator claimed, "Harrison's idea of small talk is the preamble to the Constitution." He was the first president to have electricity installed in the White House, and he was terrified of it. He refused to touch light switches, convinced they would electrocute him. If a room was dark, he'd wait for a servant to enter first and flip the switch. Some nights, the Harrison slept with the lights on because neither he nor his wife would risk turning them off. He walked like he was headed to court, brisk, upright, eyes ahead. He carried an umbrella at all times, even on clear days. Not for weather, but balance. He once said, "Every man should be prepared for both rain and surprise." Harrison had a remarkable memory. He knew the names of nearly every delegate at the Republican National Convention. As president, he memorized hundreds of names during public receptions, greeting visitors with eerie precision. "You're the gentleman from St. Louis who sent the letter on water tariffs," he'd say. People were stunned. The warmth didn't last, but the memory did. His speeches were dense, layered with legal precision, and utterly free of metaphor. He distrusted poetic language, believed it distracted from argument. When asked why he avoided dramatic flourishes, he replied, "A republic does not require adjectives." He kept a terrarium on his desk, filled with moss, small stones, and a pair of turtles. He never named them. Said they reminded him that longevity is a virtue. When reporters asked about their significance, he said only, "They're quieter than Congress." Harrison signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law to prohibit monopolistic business practices. He didn't campaign on it, didn't advertise it, just saw it as necessary. He also signed the McKinley Tariff, which raised import duties to record levels. Critics claimed it hurt consumers. Supporters claimed it protected American industry. Harrison said only, "It is the policy of solidity." He also championed civil rights legislation, a voting rights bill designed to protect Black Americans in the South, but the bill failed in the Senate. Harrison was deeply disappointed, but refused to campaign for it. "The record will speak," he said. It didn't speak loudly enough. He hosted the first Pan-American Conference, planted trees across the White House lawn, gave the first recorded presidential speech via ticker tape. But still, few remembered his voice. His presence, even when constant, felt like an outline more than a figure. He didn't shake hands for long. His grip was brief, his expression unchanged. He disliked casual touch. At receptions, he stood in one place while the crowd passed him like a conveyor belt. He bowed slightly to each guest. Didn't blink often. He was a deeply religious man. read scripture daily, attended services regularly, and avoided theater, not because he disapproved of art, but because he feared laughter might loosen his discipline. He once said, "Humor is a luxury for men not charged with a union." His wife, Caroline, died of tuberculosis during his re-election campaign. Harrison, already a distant candidate, withdrew even further. He barely campaigned, lost to Grover Cleveland, returned to Indiana in quiet defeat. Years later, he remarried, this time to his deceased wife's niece. The union caused a minor scandal, though Harrison barely noticed. The past, he said, has its place in memory, but the heart insists on its own arrangements. He practiced law until his health failed, wrote essays on governance, avoided interviews. He died in 1901, mostly forgotten, quietly respected, and never once electrocuted. And after him came William McKinley, a president with a rose in his lapel, a war on his horizon, and a future that would arrive with bullets, banners, and a man waiting in the wings named Theodore. William McKinley. William McKinley wore a red carnation in his lapel nearly every day of his adult life. He called it his lucky flower. In speeches, he'd pluck it and hand it to children in the crowd. In meetings, he'd toy with the stem absent-mindedly as if coaxing out a policy. It was never for show. It was a ritual, small, consistent, deeply felt. When asked once why he wore it, he said, "It reminds me that every day begins with a gift." McKinley was the last president to have served in the Civil War and the first to preside over America's formal arrival as an imperial power. He entered the White House with the calm of a practiced politician, but left it a martyr. His presidency was defined by soft speech and hard consequences. Behind the gold-rimmed spectacles, the gentle manner, and the deliberate phrasing was a man whose decisions launched wars, redrew maps, and ushered the United States onto the global stage. He was known for his courtesy, so much so that some thought it disqualified him from toughness. He rarely raised his voice, rarely lost his temper. His staff said he ran meetings like a Sunday school teacher guiding a lesson. And yet, when the moment came for war with Spain in 1898, it was McKinley, against his instincts, who signed the declaration. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but its impact was seismic. The United States took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. McKinley claimed it was for stability, civilization, and duty. Critics called it empire. He paced the floor for days before deciding to annex the Philippines, said he prayed night and day for light. He finally claimed God had told him the U.S. must uplift and civilize and Christianize them. The Philippines was, in fact, largely Christian already. He was precise in his speech, often repeated entire paragraphs with slight variations, searching for the most temperate possible tone. He edited his own press releases, annotated speeches in green ink. When dictating, he often paused not for breath, but for ethics, refusing to assign blame or speak ill of opponents, even when the public begged for it. He rarely ate lunch, preferring weak coffee and a few crackers. Dinner was a family affair, quiet, formal, predictable. He was a creature of habit, slept on the same side of the bed, rose at the same hour, shaved slowly, always began the day by reading the Bible aloud to himself. He adored his wife, Ida. She suffered from epilepsy and severe anxiety. McKinley never left her side during episodes. At state dinners, if she had a seizure, he would quietly place a napkin over her face and continue eating as if nothing had happened. When the moment passed, he would remove the napkin and resume conversation. Guests were instructed not to react. He refused to let her illness define her or him. He conducted politics with old-world formality, wore black suits, took slow walks, greeted people with a hand to the chest before extending his own. He remembered names, hometowns, and children's birthdays. When lobbyists visited, he'd hear them out, nod politely, then do precisely what he'd planned anyway. He loved crowds, delivered speeches from train platforms to whistling towns, believed the presidency belonged as much to the ear as to the eye. In 1900, he ran for re-election alongside Theodore Roosevelt. The campaign was energetic, but McKinley remained, as always, reserved. His slogan, 4 more years of the full dinner pail. Simple, plain, effective. He won. And then came Buffalo. In September 1901, McKinley attended the Pan American Exposition in New York. He gave a speech, toured the exhibits, met the public. On September 6th, during a receiving line at the Temple of Music, a man stepped forward with his right hand bandaged. Inside the bandage was a pistol. He fired twice into McKinley's stomach. McKinley's first reaction, concern for others. "Let no one hurt him," he said of the shooter. He was rushed to the hospital. The doctors, inexperienced with internal wounds, operated without proper tools. They couldn't find the bullet. They stitched him up, sent him home to rest. For a time, he seemed to improve. Then the infection set in. He died on September 14th. His last words, "It is God's way. His will be done, not ours." The nation mourned. His funeral procession stretched for miles. Theodore Roosevelt, now president, whispered to aides, "The old era is over." McKinley was the end of a kind of American gentility, a presidency of formality, faith, and deliberate inertia. What followed was momentum. Roosevelt, all teeth, motion, and thunder. A cowboy philosopher who boxed in the White House and governed like the century was on fire. And in a way, it was. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt entered the presidency like a cannonball hurled into a library. The quiet decorum of the McKinley era shattered beneath his boots. He was 42 years old, the youngest person ever to assume the office, and he didn't walk into power. He charged, he climbed, he boxed. He wrestled the presidency into something louder, broader, and entirely his own. He called the White House a bully pulpit. It wasn't enough for him to lead. He had to be heard. He once said that speaking softly was only useful if you also carried a big stick. And for Roosevelt, the stick was always within reach. He exercised every morning, violently. He boxed with his military aide. Sparred so hard, he eventually lost sight in one eye. He didn't tell anyone for years. He just switched to jiu-jitsu. He owned more pets than most zoos. A bear, a badger, a hyena, a one-legged rooster, snakes, a small army of guinea pigs, each named after a cabinet member. His children rode a pony through the White House halls. Once his son Quentin dropped a garter snake into a meeting with foreign diplomats. Roosevelt laughed so hard he nearly tipped over a chair. He read constantly, sometimes a book before breakfast, sometimes 3 in a day. He absorbed languages, quoted philosophy, wrote history, and yet he spoke like a man with a hammer in one hand and a telescope in the other, always balancing vision with impact. He believed in contradiction. He was both an imperialist and a conservationist, a man who expanded American military might while preserving hundreds of millions of acres of wilderness. He once said, "Leave it as it is," referring to the Grand Canyon. "You cannot improve on it," and then signed the papers to make it federally protected. He wrestled nature the way he wrestled ideas. On a hunting trip in Mississippi, he famously refused to shoot a captured bear. The story spread. A toy company asked if they could name a stuffed animal after him. He agreed. The teddy bear was born. He delivered speeches like battles, shouted, pounded fists, bared teeth. At one campaign stop, someone tried to assassinate him. The bullet hit his chest, pierced his speech manuscript, passed through his glasses case, and lodged in his ribcage. Bleeding, he stood before the crowd and declared, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He spoke for 90 minutes before seeking medical attention. He redefined what it meant to be president. He summoned reporters to his office, used press leaks as weapons, spoke directly to the people, bypassing political machines. He understood media before it became a machine. He reformed the meat packing industry. After reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and nearly vomiting over dinner, he read the book in one sitting, called Congress the next day. "This filth," he said, "must end." And then he passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. He hated indecision. Once, during a debate about whether to fire a corrupt appointee, he said, "When you're at the edge of a cliff, jumping is sometimes the only way forward." He believed in justice but feared passivity. Created the Department of Commerce and Labor, went after monopolies like a trust-busting sheriff with a legal badge. He sued railroads, dismantled tycoons, not out of vengeance, but belief. "No man," he said, "should have a fortune so large he becomes a nation unto himself." His home life was chaotic and deeply affectionate. He called his children "my wild menagerie." Let them stage pillow fights in the East Room. Once joined them on stilts in the garden. Secret Service agents took to carrying extra stilts, just in case. He never truly stopped campaigning. Even after his presidency, he couldn't sit still. He went to Africa, hunted big game, collected specimens for the Smithsonian, then toured Europe, spoke in cathedrals, debated scholars, then came home and tried to take back the White House. In 1912, he ran again, against his own party, called his platform the Bull Moose Party, gave speeches that made veins bulge, but he lost. Woodrow Wilson won. Roosevelt faded, reluctantly. He retreated to Sagamore Hill, wrote endlessly, lectured occasionally, grew grayer, softer only in health, never in will. He died in his sleep in 1919, a blood clot, peacefully. His son said, "The old lion is dead." He left behind 35 books, over 150,000 letters, national parks, a stronger navy, and a version of the presidency that roared. And the man who followed him was quieter, slower, a thinker by nature, William Howard Taft, who never quite fit the chair Roosevelt left behind. Or some would say any chair at all. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft never truly wanted to be president. What he wanted, what he longed for, was to be a judge. A quiet office, a bench, a robe, the solemn rhythm of law, not the spectacle of politics. But history, ambition, and his wife had other plans. And so he became the 27th president of the United States. Broad-shouldered, famously heavy, reluctantly powerful, and never quite comfortable in a job that demanded constant noise. Taft was the largest man to occupy the Oval Office, weighing over 300 pounds at various points. The stories about him getting stuck in a White House bathtub are apocryphal, but he did order a custom one built, 7 feet long, over 3 feet wide, made of porcelain, and large enough to fit 4 average-sized men. He took baths not as hygiene, but as meditation. They calmed him. He called them water-laced reflection. He had a voice like a cello, deep, warm, and slow-moving. He spoke in measured tones, rarely raising his volume, rarely using contractions. When asked about his public speaking style, he said, "A man should aim to persuade, not perform." His speeches were long and lawyerly. Critics said they lulled crowds into a trance. He called it due process of rhetoric. He loved food. That much is true. But more than that, he loved routine. Eggs and steak for breakfast, biscuits, weak coffee, no sauces, no spices, no surprises. He once refused a French state dinner menu and asked for roast beef and potatoes instead. When the chef objected, Taft replied, "Let them learn what democracy tastes like." His laugh was contagious and often unexpected. He wasn't gloomy, just slow to reveal delight. His staff described moments of sudden booming laughter that filled entire rooms. He once laughed so hard at a newspaper cartoon that he dropped his fork and shattered a plate. "They've made my belly bipartisan," he said. Despite his reputation for inertia, Taft was an active and nuanced thinker. He tackled trust-busting with more lawsuits than Roosevelt, though less drama. He created the Department of Labor. He pushed for tariff reform. He streamlined the postal system. But he lacked Roosevelt's thunder. He governed like a judge managing a large, unruly courtroom. He was fair. He was thoughtful. He was, in many ways, invisible. He disliked conflict. Loathed it, actually. He once delayed a decision on firing a cabinet member for 6 months simply because he dreaded the conversation. He believed persuasion should take the form of patience, not confrontation. It cost him. His relationship with Theodore Roosevelt, once mentor and friend, turned into one of the most bitter rivalries in American political history. Roosevelt felt betrayed by Taft's moderation. Taft felt cornered by Roosevelt's theatrics. In 1912, Roosevelt ran against him, splitting the Republican vote and handing the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. Taft came in third, behind his own former running mate and a Democrat he barely respected. After the loss, Taft was relieved. He didn't feign sadness. "I'm glad to be going," he said. "This is the lonesomest place in the world." But the story doesn't end there, because Taft got what he always wanted. Years later, in 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the United States, making Taft the only person in American history to lead both the executive and judicial branches. And in that marble courtroom, in those black robes, Taft came alive. He streamlined the federal judiciary, oversaw the construction of the Supreme Court building, wrote nearly 250 decisions, and smiled more often than he ever had in the White House. His judicial opinions were dense but elegant. He believed in precedent like others believed in scripture. He never raised his voice on the bench, didn't need to. He died in 1930, a few weeks after retiring. His funeral was quiet, dignified, and deeply satisfying to those who knew his true heart had always beat for the law. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, one of only 2 presidents to rest there, and the man who followed him into the White House was everything Taft was not: idealistic, academic, lofty in language, and blind to opposition until it roared. Woodrow Wilson, a man who dreamed of global peace and built a world war instead. Woodrow Wilson spoke like a man who believed words could reshape the world. He was tall, severe, and so deeply professorial that even his small talk sounded like a lecture. He came to the presidency with a PhD, the mind of a constitutional scholar, and a vocabulary that often left crowds blinking in polite confusion. He believed in ideas with such intensity that reality sometimes became a distraction. He rarely told jokes. When he did, they sounded like legal hypotheticals. At dinner parties, he talked more than he listened, scribbled notes on napkins, and often forgot the names of guests, even those sitting beside him. But when he took the stage, deliberate posture, piercing eyes, chin slightly lifted, people leaned forward. His oratory had gravity, and he used it like a lighthouse during a storm. Wilson believed in morality as policy. He saw the presidency not as an office, but as a pulpit. Every law was a sermon, every treaty a confession. He spoke often of duty, sacrifice, and the soul of democracy. His tone was part Lincoln, part Old Testament prophet. He used words like redemption, mission, and destiny in legislative memos. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, rarely raised his voice. His self-control bordered on ascetic, but he could hold a grudge like it was scripture. He remembered every slight, forgave very few. Once, when asked about a political rival's suggestion, he responded, "He has mistaken eloquence for substance, which is unfortunate for both." He was the son of a preacher, born in Virginia, raised during the Civil War. That dual inheritance, Southern loyalty and Presbyterian rigor, shaped him. He believed in order, in God's plan, and in the Constitution as a living contract between man and moral progress. He served as president of Princeton University before entering politics. He wore academic robes with ease and spoke of governance as if it were a syllabus. His handwriting was slanted and elegant, his margins full of corrections. His journals read like a blend of theology and political science. He was elected governor of New Jersey and then president in 1912, thanks in part to the split between Roosevelt and Taft. He arrived in Washington soft-spoken but confident, a reformer with a chalkboard soul. His first term was filled with domestic change. The Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission, the Clayton Antitrust Act. He introduced the modern income tax, reined in monopolies, protected workers, called it the New Freedom. But freedom for Wilson always came packaged in paternalism. Then came the war. World War I exploded across Europe. Wilson kept the U.S. neutral, lectured both sides, urged restraint. But as German submarines attacked American ships and telegrams revealed secret plots, neutrality became unsustainable. In 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, not with excitement, but solemnity. The world must be made safe for democracy, he declared. It was the line that defined his presidency and, in many ways, shattered it. Wilson threw the nation into war with academic zeal, mobilized the economy, drafted soldiers, censored newspapers, created the Committee on Public Information, which mass-produced patriotic propaganda with the efficiency of a factory. He oversaw a vast, rapid expansion of federal power, waged war not just against Germany, but against dissent. Thousands were arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Free speech, his own cherished medium, was curtailed. When questioned, Wilson responded, "Loyalty is not always spoken." The war ended in 1918. And then came Versailles. Wilson traveled to Europe, a sitting president crossing the Atlantic. A first, he was welcomed like a prophet. He brought with him his blueprint for peace, the 14 points. At its heart was the League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective security. He believed in it with religious fervor. He negotiated for it, preached it, sacrificed other goals for it. But when he returned home, he faced a Senate unwilling to ratify the treaty. Led by Henry Cabot Lodge, an old, cold adversary, opponents feared entangling alliances and limits on American sovereignty. Wilson refused to compromise. Not a word, not a comma. He believed the League was a moral obligation, not a negotiable clause. He began a national speaking tour to rally support, city after city, speech after speech, until, in Colorado, he collapsed. A stroke. He was paralyzed on his left side. His mouth drooped, his vision blurred, but the White House downplayed it. For months, the country was led by a man unable to lead, and by his wife Edith, who filtered information, guarded the bedroom door, and unofficially ran the executive branch. She called it stewardship. Others called it a silent coup. Wilson never fully recovered. He sat at his desk, composed letters, listened to advisors through half-closed eyes. He still believed, still spoke of the League, but the Senate rejected it. He left office in 1921. Bitter, disillusioned, certain he was right. He died 3 years later in a Washington townhouse, just blocks from the Capitol. His final words, "I am ready." He left behind a nation transformed, economically, militarily, diplomatically, and divided. His shadow fell across the 20th century. His ideals birthed both global cooperation and governmental overreach, and the man who followed him was the opposite in every possible way. Warren G. Harding, a man who didn't want to change the world, just return it to something simpler, softer, and quieter. At least that's what he said. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding didn't promise greatness. He promised normalcy. After the war, after Wilson, after global crusades and sweeping reforms and national exhaustion, Harding offered something radical in its simplicity, calm. A return, he said, not to heroics, but to healing. The word normalcy was ridiculed at the time. Critics claimed it wasn't even a word. Harding didn't care. He liked how it sounded. It felt restful. He won by a landslide. He looked presidential, tall, silver-haired, square-jawed, and perpetually photogenic in the black and white geometry of early newsprint. He had a broadcaster's voice and a newspaper editor's instinct for public appetite. Before politics, he ran the Marion Star in Ohio. He never stopped thinking like an editor. Headlines mattered, grammar could wait. He wasn't a deep thinker, and he admitted it. He once said, "I'm a man of limited talents from a small town." That was not false modesty. It was strategic. Harding governed like a man who believed his job was to calm the room and delegate the rest. And that's where the trouble started. He appointed friends. Lots of them. Old poker buddies, newspaper pals, political hangers-on. He called them the best minds, but history calls them the Ohio Gang. They filled top offices with backslapping charm and quiet schemes. Harding, trusting to a fault, signed what they gave him, smiled, played poker, and poured drinks behind closed doors. Prohibition be damned. He gambled in the White House library, smoked cigars, drank whiskey from coffee mugs. His weekly poker games lasted deep into the night. Once, he bet an entire set of White House china and lost. He laughed, said, "That's why they make replacements." He was superstitious, carried lucky coins, refused to travel on Fridays, touched wood before speeches, once consulted an astrologer before signing a bill. He said he didn't believe in omens, just signposts from the uncertain. Harding had a habit of vanishing, sometimes emotionally, sometimes literally. He once disappeared during a state visit to Boston. Secret Service found him in a cigar lounge, alone, reading baseball scores. He waved them off. "The world can wait an inning," he said. His speeches were long on alliteration and short on clarity. Critics called them linguistic taffy, chewy, shapeless, and sweet-sounding. He once described America as a great, forward-looking people with confidence in the righteousness of our institutions and faith in the destiny of our republic. When asked what that meant, he shrugged. "It means we're fine." But he wasn't entirely asleep at the wheel. He pushed for civil rights protections, spoke out against lynching, and called for better treatment of Black Americans, a rarity among presidents of his era. He created the Bureau of the Budget, advocated for world disarmament, commuted the sentence of socialist Eugene Putai Debs, who had run against him from prison. Harding even invited Debs to the White House. When asked why, he said, A prison does not make a man less American. Yet scandal was catching up. The Teapot Dome affair, a tangled mess of bribes, oil leases, and federal land, would explode after his death, but signs were already appearing. Officials were disappearing. Money was moving strangely. Harding began to suspect betrayal. "My friends," he said. "My goddamn friends. They're the ones that keep me walking the floor at night." In 1923, he began a cross-country voyage of understanding, a publicity tour to reconnect with the American people. He traveled west, gave speeches, posed for photos, waved to crowds. He looked tired, complained of stomach pain, grew pale. In San Francisco, on August 2nd, 1923, Harding died suddenly in his hotel suite. The cause was listed as a heart attack. No autopsy was performed. Rumors swirled. Poison, stroke, cover-up. None confirmed. He was 57. His wife, Florence, protective, sharp-tongued, and fiercely loyal, refused a second examination. "He suffered enough," she said. The scandals exploded after his death. Teapot Dome, Veterans Bureau corruption, missing funds, secret slush accounts. America mourned Harding, then turned on his legacy. He went from beloved to ridiculed in months. And then there were the love letters. Thousands of pages between Harding and his mistress, Carrie Fulton Phillips, were sealed until decades later. In them, Harding signed as Jerry, called her "my darlingest," described in vivid detail his longing. In one, he wrote of his anatomy as "Little Jerry." It was not little, it was national news. Harding's reputation never recovered, but his presidency revealed something enduring. America at times prefers comfort over complexity, smiles over systems, handshakes over ideologies. And after him came Calvin Coolidge, who spoke half as much, smiled even less, and believed that silence, done right, could govern an entire country. Calvin Coolidge didn't believe in noise. He believed in pauses, in stillness, in choosing words the way a watchmaker selects gears, deliberately, sparingly, and only when they served a purpose. He was a president of absence more than presence, of restraint more than reform, and of silences so prolonged they felt like policy statements. They called him Silent Cal. The name stuck like frost on a Vermont windowpane, which is where he came from. Plymouth Notch, a town so quiet you could hear snowfall land. He carried that quiet into the White House and wielded it like a shield or a scalpel. He was sworn in by lamplight by his own father, a notary public after Warren G. Harding's sudden death. No fanfare, no reporters, just Coolidge in his pajamas, a Bible on a table, and a country in need of a voice. What it got was a whisper. He once said, 9/10 of a president's duties are to say no. He meant it. He vetoed bills with one-word statements. He shrank the federal government, cut taxes, slashed spending, balanced the budget, and then stood back and let the roaring 20s roar. He believed prosperity didn't need direction, just room to run. He viewed government like a referee, not a player, said that the business of America is business, and refused to apologize for it. Coolidge kept his office sparse. A few pens, a calendar, and a portrait of Lincoln. He read every morning, avoided interruptions, held short cabinet meetings, once ended one after 5 minutes, declaring, there was nothing further to discuss. His staff learned to compress complexity into sentences. Some briefings were single-page memos. If he asked a question, it usually began with, why? And ended with, are you sure? He was a man of habits. Breakfast at 8, work until noon, a nap in the afternoon, every day without exception, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 3. When asked about it, he replied, it is better to go to bed with a clear head than with a cluttered one. He didn't like being touched, avoided hugs, recoiled from handshakes unless required. He'd nod stiffly in greeting. Once at a state dinner, a woman bet her friend she could get Coolidge to say more than 3 words. When she told him about the wager, he looked at her and said, you lose. He had a dry, almost spectral sense of humor. One 4th of July, he handed reporters slips of paper with his message to the nation. It read, independence is a good thing. That was it. He kept pet raccoons on the White House grounds, Rebecca and Reuben. They were meant to be Thanksgiving dinner. Coolidge spared them, built them a little house, walked them on leashes, called them troublesome but deserving. He loved having his head rubbed with petroleum jelly, not for vanity, for circulation, he claimed. Staff would gently massage his scalp for minutes at a time as he sat silently with his eyes closed. No music, no conversation, just the sound of fingers in hair and a man pondering a tax code revision. Coolidge rarely left Washington. When he did, he vacationed in South Dakota, wearing a cowboy hat he clearly didn't believe in. Photographers loved it. He endured it. His expression in most photos looks like someone trying to make peace with a goat. He was devout but private, attended church regularly, read the Bible quietly, believed the presidency was a moral responsibility, not a personal journey. When his son, Calvin Jr., died suddenly of blood poisoning after developing a blister from playing tennis without socks, Coolidge was shattered. He never fully recovered. In his autobiography, he wrote, "When he died, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. He never campaigned loudly, never ran for drama. He won by being the absence of chaos." In 1924, he ran under the slogan, "Keep cool with Coolidge." America did. And then, without warning, he left. In 1928, reporters asked if he'd seek another term. He handed them a small piece of paper that read, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was it. No explanation, no speech. Just a sentence. Perfectly measured, perfectly him. He returned to Northampton, Massachusetts. Lived simply. Refused memoir deals. Spoke rarely. Wrote only when asked. When the stock market crashed in 1929, he didn't gloat, didn't speak. Just looked out the window, folded his hands, and said, "I told them." He died quietly in 1933 while shaving. A man of few words who believed the presidency should be felt more than heard. And after him came Herbert Hoover, an engineer, a humanitarian, a man who fed millions abroad but could not feed hope at home. The next president would enter office in prosperity and fall headfirst into the longest night of the American century. Herbert Hoover knew how to solve problems until the problem stopped caring about solutions. He was an engineer by training, a humanitarian by instinct, and a president whose name would become synonymous with despair. When he entered office in 1929, he was one of the most respected men in America. When he left, his name was stamped onto shantytowns and bread lines, Hoovervilles, Hoover blankets, Hoover flags. His fall was not a simple collapse. It was a slow-motion unraveling of belief and control. He was born in a tiny Iowa village to Quaker parents, orphaned by age 9, raised by relatives. He spoke little as a child, but absorbed everything. By 27, he was a self-made millionaire, having built his fortune in mining. By 35, he'd already coordinated global food relief efforts for millions during World War I. The Belgian people called him the Great Humanitarian. He never liked the title, said it made him sound sentimental. He kept lists, dozens of them, tasks, thoughts, economic charts. His mind worked in diagrams. He believed anything could be improved with enough data. He wrote notes to himself in pencil, margins crammed with variables and percentages. He often sketched flow charts instead of writing sentences. He hated small talk, found it inefficient. He once ended a conversation at a state dinner by saying, "The matter is not actionable," then resumed eating silently. He didn't drink, rarely laughed, didn't like public speaking. He spoke in clauses, not cadence. His sentences trailed off when ideas outpaced language. When asked why he didn't smile more, he answered, "The job doesn't call for it." And then, 7 months into his presidency, the stock market crashed. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday, banks collapsed. Businesses folded. Unemployment skyrocketed. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Hoover's first instinct was to organize, to plan, to engineer a way out. He refused to see the collapse as a failure of capitalism. He believed the system was sound. It just needed confidence. He urged business leaders not to cut wages, encouraged voluntary cooperation, launched public works projects, but he resisted direct federal aid to individuals. He believed it would erode character. Prosperity, he said, cannot be restored by raids upon the public treasury. To the public, this sounded like callousness. To Hoover, it was principle. He lived in the White House like a wartime general. Early mornings, late nights, thick folders, no distraction. He read 5 newspapers before breakfast, wrote policy memos by hand, refused to delegate. Staff described the mood as airless. He installed a phone in his private office that rang to nowhere. just a signal device to keep meetings moving. If it rang, the meeting ended. Only Hoover answered. He had one of the first air-conditioned offices in Washington, but rarely used it, said the noise disrupted his concentration. He preferred heat and silence. He loved fishing, not because he enjoyed it, but because it gave him a pretense to be alone, motionless, unbothered. He once said, "All men are equal before fish." When a reporter asked what he thought about while fishing, Hoover replied, "Escape." In 1932, as the Depression deepened, Hoover faced Franklin Delano Roosevelt in one of the most lopsided presidential elections in history. He campaigned grimly, lectured audiences on credit systems, warned against reckless experimentation. Roosevelt smiled. Hoover scowled. Roosevelt promised a new deal. Hoover offered a complex financial instrument. He lost in a landslide. And yet, as Roosevelt prepared to take office, Hoover warned him, urgently, repeatedly, about the fragile state of the banking system. Roosevelt refused to commit to any plan before the inauguration. The banks collapsed days later. Hoover never forgave him. After leaving office, Hoover withdrew, wrote, traveled, endured ridicule. Crowds booed him, papers mocked him. His name became shorthand for failure. But he didn't retreat in bitterness. He built an archive, published multiple volumes. He believed history would exonerate him, and slowly it began to. Years later, Truman asked Hoover to help reorganize the executive branch. Eisenhower leaned on him for advice. He lived to see the beginning of his reputation's rehabilitation. Still, he rarely smiled in public. He died in 1964, at 90, outlived 6 presidents, buried near his birthplace in West Branch, Iowa. On his grave is carved, "He put his faith in facts and the spirit of free men, and the man who followed him brought everything Hoover lacked: charm, hope, fireside chats, and the boldest experiment in American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who couldn't walk, but never once stood still. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt never walked into a room. He entered it with orchestration. A tilt of the head, a cigarette holder clenched between his teeth at a perfect angle, a voice that melted static off radios. He could not move his legs, but he commanded space. Couldn't stand unaided, but lifted a nation by sheer force of voice. In the middle of the Great Depression, with banks closing, crops dying, and faith circling the drain, America chose a man who refused to call it a crisis. He called it a challenge, and then he told them not to be afraid. FDR was struck by polio in 1921 at age 39. He never walked again unaided, but he trained himself to stand with braces, to appear in public only after rehearsed entrances. He refused to be photographed in his wheelchair. He didn't want pity. He wanted authority. What he lost in mobility, he replaced with presence. He looked up at people, deliberately, made them lean in, made them feel heard. He surrounded himself with brains, economists, reformers, insiders, outsiders. He called them his brain trust and listened more than he talked in meetings. But when he did speak, it was like the final stroke of a pen, measured, decisive, impossible to erase. He talked to the country through fireside chats, those radio addresses that turned the White House into a warm corner of every American home. He spoke plainly, explained the banking system in 3 sentences, told people how to reopen their savings, called them friends. Listeners wept. Others stood at attention in their living rooms. It wasn't magic, it was clarity. And then came the New Deal. FDR's answer to a country coming apart at the seams wasn't just one program. It was dozens, created in rapid-fire succession. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the Social Security Act. He flooded the economy with work, with dams, with highways, with hope. Some saw it as salvation, others called it socialism. Roosevelt didn't flinch. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity, he said, than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. He was re-elected 3 times. No president had done it before. None have done it since. He filled the presidency like water fills a glass, refracted power, warped its boundaries, and never apologized for it. He expanded the federal government. He challenged the Supreme Court. He pushed bills through Congress with such speed the press dubbed them alphabet soup. NRA, TVA, CCC, UPA. FDR made policy feel like jazz, fast, improvisational, and somehow still composed. He had secrets, he had charm, he had polio, a sharp temper, and a smile he used like currency. He loved small animals and big cigars. He often held a cigarette aloft, never smoking it, using it more like punctuation than habit. Staff knew when a sentence was over by the tilt of the cigarette. He was a master of contradiction, born to privilege, but beloved by the poor, a patrician voice, yet the champion of workers, bound to a wheelchair, yet unstoppable. And then came the war. World War II began in Europe in 1939. America, burned by the Great War, wanted no part. Roosevelt waited, watched, armed allies quietly, positioned carefully. Then Pearl Harbor struck in 1941. America entered, and Roosevelt stood before Congress, legs locked in braces, and declared December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The war consumed everything. FDR became a wartime president, not through bloodlust but strategy. He coordinated with Churchill and Stalin. He navigated egos, fronts, and timelines. He smiled at generals, whispered to spies, and massaged public opinion like clay. And he signed Executive Order 9066, interning over 100,000 Japanese Americans, a decision that still shadows his legacy. He said it was for security. Others saw racism, fear, and betrayal. He created the GI Bill, drafted plans for the United Nations, envisioned a post-war world of collective peace, but his health was deteriorating fast. By his fourth term, he looked like a ghost in a navy cape, skin pale, eyes dark. The public didn't know how sick he was. His aides did, his doctors did. He pushed on anyway. He had work left. In April 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, his retreat, Roosevelt sat for a portrait. Halfway through, he collapsed. Cerebral hemorrhage. He died within hours. His final words were mundane. "I have a terrific headache," and then he was gone. Millions mourned. Some wrote poems, others simply wept. There had been no America in the 20th century without Roosevelt in it, and the man who followed him had only been vice president for 82 days. Harry S. Truman, a former haberdasher, a man who hadn't even been told about the atomic bomb yet, and would soon decide whether or not to use it. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman was never supposed to be president. Not really. He wasn't in Roosevelt's inner circle. He wasn't briefed on the war's deepest secrets. He hadn't even been told about the Manhattan Project. He was vice president for just 82 days. More ribbon cutting than strategy, before Franklin Roosevelt died and left him quite suddenly in charge of the world. When Eleanor Roosevelt found him, she said simply, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman, stunned, asked if there was anything he could do for her. She replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." And she was right. Truman wasn't a general. He wasn't an Ivy Leaguer. He didn't quote Plato or own a yacht. He came from Independence, Missouri, wore thick glasses, sold hats for a living before politics. His voice was flat, his suits were rumpled, and his middle name was just the letter S. Not short for anything, just S. He read history obsessively, wrote letters by the dozens, played piano with stiff fingers, took long walks before dawn, alone, thinking. He wasn't charismatic, but he was clear. He wasn't poetic, but he was precise. His motto, "The buck stops here." No excuses, no passing the problem. He became president in April 1945, just weeks before the Nazis surrendered in Europe, and months before the US dropped atomic bombs on Japan. That decision, the weight of it, landed in his lap without warning. He was told about the Manhattan Project after taking office. He digested the science, listened to generals, asked questions, then signed off on a weapon the world had never seen and wouldn't forget. On August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. On August 9th, Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands died. Instantly, slowly, permanently, the war ended. Truman called it a necessity. Critics called it monstrous. The debate never ended. He didn't flinch in public. In private, he wrote, "It is an awful responsibility that has come to us." Then he kept moving. He desegregated the armed forces with a stroke of the pen, ordered it while Congress fumed. He said, "My forebears fought to free men. I intend to honor them." He faced death threats. He didn't care. He recognized the new state of Israel 11 minutes after it declared independence. He said, "I am Cyrus," referencing the Persian king who freed the Jews from Babylon. When aides warned it would alienate Arab nations, he replied, "I am not running for profit. I am doing what is right." Truman lived above a shop as a boy. He kept that simplicity. He rose at 5 a.m., took morning walks, and refused to hire a butler. Said it was un-American. He signed letters in blue ink, refused to use a typewriter for personal notes, believed handwriting showed character. He ran for re-election in 1948, and no one thought he'd win. Polls showed him behind by double digits. Newspapers pre-printed headlines, "Dewey defeats Truman." He laughed when he held one up the next morning, victorious. "They didn't count the people who whisper," he said. He campaigned by train, gave hundreds of speeches, often without notes, straight to the point, called Congress do nothing to their faces, wore fedoras, wiped sweat from his neck with a handkerchief, looked like a farmer yelling at a stubborn cow. Voters loved it. He survived assassination attempts. 2 Puerto Rican nationalists stormed Blair House, where he was staying during White House renovations. Gunfire erupted. A policeman died. Truman remained calm. Later, he wrote that he hoped for justice, not vengeance. He began the Marshall Plan, contained communism with the Truman Doctrine, started NATO, sent American troops to Korea, fired General Douglas MacArthur when the man tried to hijack policy. When asked why, he said, "I didn't fire him because he was wrong. I fired him because he wouldn't shut up." He left office in 1953, deeply unpopular, war fatigue, inflation, scandals in his administration, but he left with his spine intact. He refused money for memoirs, refused to serve on corporate boards, said the presidency was not for sale. He moved back to Missouri, lived in a modest home, took morning walks, visited the library he helped build, paid for his own postage, answered letters by hand until his eyes failed. When asked later how he handled the presidency, he said, "I did what I could with what I had, where I was. If you want perfect men, you'll be waiting a long time." He died in 1972. His casket was simple, his funeral short, his impact vast, and the man who followed him into office, tall, smiling, war-tested, and media-ready, would change the stage forever. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general who spoke like a grandfather and planned like a battlefield, never stopped expanding. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't conquer the presidency. He coasted into it like a 5-star general stepping down from Olympus. He was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, the man who'd orchestrated D-Day, the liberator of camps, the tactician of total war. When he ran for president in 1952, it wasn't about ideas. It was about reassurance. He promised to stop the Korean War, curb inflation, and keep the country steady. And America said yes. He spoke plainly, smiled often, played golf. He wasn't a soaring orator, but he didn't need to be. His presence alone was enough. When asked what he liked most about being president, he said, "The people still wave at me when I drive by." That wasn't false humility. That was the goal. He didn't want to rule. He wanted to manage. His nickname was Ike. Campaign buttons said simply, "I like Ike." It was less a slogan than a national mood. He seemed immune to political gravity. Democrats respected him, Republicans trusted him, voters adored him. His approval ratings hovered around 70%, even as crises broke out around him. But behind the grin was a mind sharpened by decades of strategy. Eisenhower hated waste. He ran the White House like a military base, held staff meetings like briefings, created flow charts for policy decisions, used yellow notepads, lined precisely. His personal notes often included countdowns, maps, and margin summaries. He saw government as machinery, slow but fixable. He brought order to chaos, reined in spending, balanced budgets, expanded Social Security, built the interstate highway system, a 41,000-mile spiderweb of roads that would transform the country forever. When asked if the highways were about commerce or convenience, Eisenhower replied, "They are for tanks first, comfort second." He spoke of peace constantly, but never without a warning. He believed military strength deterred war, but he also feared the monster he helped build. In his farewell address, he coined the term military-industrial complex, a quiet rebuke to the very system he had shaped. "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence," he warned. It was a whisper that still echoes. He loved golf, played regularly, not to unwind, but to think. He once said that a fairway was the best place to prepare for a press conference. He didn't cheat, didn't boast, just played. Once snapped a putter in frustration, then quietly paid the club for the damage. He had a temper, but only in private. Cabinet members saw it. He'd pace, swear under his breath, pound his fist, then reemerge composed. He believed public emotion was weakness. Anger, he said, is an admission of surprise. A leader should never be surprised. He detested McCarthyism, loathed the red-baiting hysteria of the early 1950s, but he handled Senator Joseph McCarthy with silence, not spectacle. He starved him of attention, let him collapse under his own excess. Critics called it cowardice. Ike called it strategy. He integrated schools, slowly, reluctantly, but firmly. When 9 black students were blocked from entering Little Rock Central High School in 1957, Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to escort them, not because he wanted to, but because the Constitution demanded it. The federal law, he said, must be upheld. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first such bill since Reconstruction. It was weak, watered down by Congress, but it cracked the wall. He hated politics. Once said, "I never wanted to be a politician, and I still don't." He left speeches to others, avoided drama, delegated well. Some called him lazy, others called it tactical detachment. What looked like golf was often strategy in motion. His private letters were full of reflection, on war, on duty, on mortality. He wrote to soldiers' families, signed condolence notes by hand. When someone praised him for saving the West, he replied, "I was lucky. Brave men followed orders. That's all." He had a heart attack in 1955, recovered, served a second term, then retired quietly to Gettysburg. On a farm just a few miles from where Lincoln spoke of a nation reborn, Eisenhower tended the land, painted landscapes, greeted tourists with a wave, and rarely mentioned the White House again. He died in 1969. The funeral was modest, flags at half-mast, soldiers at attention. The country paused for a moment to remember the man who'd held it steady through a nuclear age, a civil rights awakening, and a Cold War that never quite thawed. And after him came the youngest man ever elected president, a Catholic, a war hero, a man who turned charm into policy and image into power. John F. Kennedy, the golden sun, the candle in the storm. John Fitzgerald Kennedy didn't just win the presidency, he redefined it. He was 43 years old, Catholic, charismatic, brilliant in debate, magnetic on camera, and physically frail in ways the public never saw. He arrived in office like a myth in motion, wind-blown hair, crisp suits, and a voice that turned Cold War dread into Shakespearean resolve. His speeches were not just policy, they were poetry in orbit. But behind the glamour was a body held together by sheer willpower. Kennedy had Addison's disease, a condition that left his adrenal system barely functioning. He took daily injections, lived with chronic pain, and wore a back brace almost constantly. He swam to ease the pressure, smiled to hide it, and never once let on how badly he hurt. In private, his aides sometimes had to help him dress. In public, he bounded upstairs with cinematic ease. He believed in motion, in image, in momentum. He once said, "Let us begin," and meant it in every sense. His inauguration speech crackled with global voltage. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. He surrounded himself with intellect, what the press called the best and the brightest. Rhodes Scholars, Ivy Leaguers, experts with folders and theories. His cabinet meetings often sounded like graduate seminars, but Kennedy, despite the polish, trusted gut over graphs. He made decisions with fast instincts and clean sentences. He stared down nuclear war in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world ever came to ending itself. Soviet missiles in Cuba, American warships in the Atlantic, generals itching for airstrikes. Kennedy chose a blockade, a pause, a line between restraint and annihilation, 13 days of tension. One letter from Khrushchev, then another, more hostile one. Kennedy ignored the second, responded only to the first. War was avoided. He never called it a victory. He supported civil rights, cautiously at first, then urgently, sent federal troops to enforce desegregation at the University of Mississippi, called racial inequality a moral crisis, proposed sweeping civil rights legislation, but his presidency was more promise than fulfillment, cut short before the work could be done. He was funny, dry, devastatingly so. At a dinner honoring Nobel laureates, he quipped, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent ever gathered at the White House, except perhaps when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." He hosted artists, astronauts, kings, and school children with equal grace. He loved words, collected quotes, wrote notes in the margins of books. One said poetry was the ultimate weapon against tyranny. He had a wife, Jacqueline, who became an icon in her own right, graceful, fluent in French, camera-proof. Their marriage was both private theater and public symbol. Behind the scenes, Kennedy's infidelities were well known. His charisma didn't stop at the podium, but the First Lady stood by him, elegant, enigmatic, and impossibly poised. He created the Peace Corps, pushed for a man on the moon, said the words, "We choose to go to the moon, not because he believed in space, but because he believed in courage." And then Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. A motorcade, a convertible, a crowd cheering beneath a bright Texas sky. A shot, then another, Jackie crawling onto the trunk in shock. Secret Service leaping, the car speeding away. He was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. The world froze. Conspiracy theories exploded. A lone gunman, a magic bullet, a silenced witness. To this day, the killing feels less like an event than a rupture in national memory. Unrepaired, unresolved. Kennedy was buried at Arlington, where an eternal flame still burns. His funeral drew kings, queens, soldiers, and millions of stunned Americans. His son, John Jr., saluted the casket. The image became history. His presidency lasted just 1,036 days, and yet it reshaped the office. He gave the presidency style, wit, speed, elegance. He made it feel like the center of the moral world, even if it wasn't. And after him came Lyndon B. Johnson. Crude, towering, mercilessly effective, a Southern brawler who dragged the country into Vietnam and civil rights history, whether it wanted to go or not. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't step into the presidency. He grabbed it, gripped it, and never let go. At 6'3" with ears like radar dishes and hands that felt like pliers, LBJ was less a politician and more a force of gravity. When Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson was sworn in just 99 minutes later, aboard Air Force One, Jackie Kennedy beside him, her dress still stained with blood. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He went to work. LBJ understood power, not as poetry, not as theater, but as muscle. He'd spent decades in the Senate, where he rose like a storm, minority leader, then majority leader, commanding floor votes like a general commanding troops. He knew every back room, every pressure point, every senator's weakness, vanity, and birthday. He didn't ask for support. He extracted it. His methods were legendary. The Johnson treatment, he'd lean in close, nose inches from yours, eyes wide, voice booming, fingers jabbing, lips curling around threats and compliments until you didn't know whether to run or sign the bill. He once convinced a senator to vote yes on civil rights by quoting the man's own speeches back to him, word for word, until the senator caved under the weight of his own past. He swore constantly, gave interviews while sitting on the toilet, took meetings with his feet in a sink, pulled staffers into his car and refused to let them out until they agreed with him. He had custom-tailored suits with extra deep pockets for his large hands and larger ambitions. And yet, beneath the bluster, there was calculation. After Kennedy's death, Johnson could have played it safe. Instead, he passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, stronger than any before it. It banned segregation in public places, enforced voting rights. Johnson knew it would cost him the South. "We have lost the South for a generation," he said after signing it. He signed anyway. Then came the Great Society. Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, the Voting Rights Act, federal education funding, public broadcasting, urban renewal, food stamps, clean air and water protections. LBJ didn't just expand government. He detonated it into every corner of American life. He declared a war on poverty, created job training programs, housing assistance, and civil rights enforcement teams. He said, "This administration will not allow the poor to be forgotten at the doorstep of prosperity." And yet, there was Vietnam. What began as a small advisory mission under Kennedy ballooned under Johnson into a full-scale war. 500,000 American troops deployed. Countless Vietnamese lives lost. Cities bombed, villages destroyed, protests erupted across college campuses. Body counts filled the nightly news. Johnson watched support drain like blood through gauze. He hated the war, feared communism, refused to lose. He listened to generals but trusted his instincts until they betrayed him. He read letters from soldiers' mothers at night. They broke him. He began pacing, talking to himself, shouting at aides. He once said, "I feel like a hitchhiker caught in a hailstorm on a Texas highway. I can't run, I can't hide, and I can't make it stop." He rarely slept, ate voraciously, gained weight, watched war coverage in silence, barked orders, then disappeared to his Texas ranch to escape the noise, only to bring it with him. He became paranoid, secretive, obsessed with leaks, believed the press was out to destroy him. He recorded conversations, listened to tapes alone in the dark, tried to control what couldn't be controlled. In 1968, he shocked the country. "I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The war had hollowed him. He was done. He left office and returned to his ranch, let his hair grow long, refused interviews, read newspapers with a red pen, circling names. He died in 1973, just months after Nixon visited China and months before the U.S. began pulling out of Vietnam. He was both giant and ghost, a man who passed the most sweeping civil rights legislation in a century and lost a generation's trust overseas, a president who knew how to use power and couldn't stop its consequences, and the man who followed him would promise peace with honor. Richard Nixon, the strategist, the survivor, the president who won big and lost everything. Richard Milhouse Nixon didn't just want to be president, he needed it. He climbed toward the office like a man scaling a wall he believed the world had built to keep him out. And for a while, he stayed at the top. He opened China, ended the draft, created the EPA, and spoke of peace while waging war. But beneath the victories, something always gnawed at him, a kind of political gravity that pulled him downward. He would become the only president in American history to resign. Nixon was not a man of charm. He didn't dazzle crowds. He sweated on camera, blinked too often, spoke in a nasal hum that seemed allergic to intimacy. But he was brilliant, tactically, legally, rhetorically. His sentences could twist steel. His memory was encyclopedic. He remembered opponents' middle names and allies' missteps. He saw politics as chess, with a knife hidden under the board. He came from Yorba Linda, California, poor Quaker and perpetually underestimated. His mother called him a man of destiny. His father sold groceries. Nixon worked his way through the law school, joined the Navy, and returned home ready to run, not for the sake of power, but to win against people who had once dismissed him. He rose fast. Vice president under Eisenhower, ran for president in 1960, and lost to Kennedy in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. He felt robbed, bitter. In 1962, he ran for governor of California and lost again. He told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," then disappeared. 6 years later, he came back. In 1968, with the Vietnam War raging and cities burning from civil unrest, Nixon offered something simple: law and order, silent majorities, stability. He spoke to Americans who felt left behind by revolution and tired of idealism. He won. Then he won again by a landslide in 1972. And during that second term, the ceiling cracked. But first, the triumphs. Nixon went to China. In 1972, the man who'd once called the Chinese government bloodthirsty tyrants boarded Air Force One and shook hands with Mao Zedong. The visit shattered decades of diplomatic frost. It was bold, unthinkable, genius. Nixon called it the week that changed the world. He also signed the SALT I treaty with the Soviet Union, limiting nuclear weapons. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, enforced desegregation in southern schools, ended the draft, launched revenue sharing, reformed welfare. But no one talks about that first. They talk about Watergate. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. They carried wiretaps, cash, and lies. It was sloppy and unnecessary. Nixon was already winning big, but his campaign didn't just want victory. They wanted intel, insurance, dirt. Nixon at first denied involvement. Then he tried to manage it. Then to cover it. But he had made a mistake. He taped everything. Conversations, meetings, paranoia on tape, silence where there should have been truth. As reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein dug deeper, as courts demanded tapes, as aides resigned or were indicted, Nixon began to shrink behind the desk he once commanded. He called the investigation a witch hunt, claimed executive privilege, fired the special prosecutor, called the press enemies. Sound familiar? Then the tape with the smoking gun was released. August 8th, 1974. Nixon went on television and resigned. No apology, no tears, just resignation. I have never been a quitter, he said, but as president, I must put the interest of America first. The next morning he boarded Marine One, turned, raised both hands in the air in that strange, final V for victory pose, and vanished into the California sun. He was pardoned by Gerald Ford, his successor and former vice president, just a month later. Ford said the country needed healing. Critics said it was a deal. Nixon lived for 2 more decades, wrote books, gave interviews, slowly returned to public respectability as an elder statesman of foreign policy. But the damage never quite faded. He died in 1994, eulogized by presidents, respected, still controversial, always alone. His tombstone reads, "The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker." And the man who pardoned him, Gerald Ford, had never been elected president or vice president, just appointed, the accidental president, who would walk into the White House in a storm and try to mop the floors. Gerald R. Ford. Gerald Rudolph Ford was not elected to be vice president. He was not elected to be president. He was simply next in line when everything else fell apart. The only American to occupy both offices without a single vote cast in his name. He called it an unexpected inheritance. Most others just called it a mess. When Nixon resigned in 1974, the country was running on fumes. Scandal, inflation, foreign tension, and an economy on the edge of recession. Ford walked into the Oval Office with steady hands and a battered moral compass. His first words as president weren't scripted. They were improvised. Our long national nightmare's over. But nightmares don't end on cue. He was a decent man, a former football player, Navy veteran, House Minority Leader, Midwestern to the marrow. He wasn't brilliant, but he was solid. No affectation, no drama. He mowed his own lawn, ate dinner at 6, smiled awkwardly, and mispronounced nuclear like half the country. Ford's presidency was one long act of stabilization. He wasn't there to change the world, just to keep it from crumbling. But then he did the one thing no American had ever done. He pardoned a president, a full, unconditional pardon for Richard Nixon, barely a month after Nixon resigned. The reaction was volcanic. Public approval collapsed overnight. Critics screamed betrayal. Protesters surrounded the White House. Congress held hearings. Ford said he wanted the country to heal, to move forward. But the wound had barely scabbed, and now it felt erased. He lost political capital he never really had, but he didn't back down. I must put the interests of America ahead of my own, he said, even if it cost me the presidency. It nearly did. Ford faced a deeply fractured country. Inflation was rising. Unemployment was high. Trust in government was radioactive. He launched a campaign called Whip Inflation Now, WIN. It involved buttons, rhetoric, speeches. No one took it seriously. The buttons became a national punchline. Economists laughed. Ford kept wearing his. He survived 2 assassination attempts, both within 3 weeks. The first, a follower of Charles Manson. The second, a radical activist in San Francisco. Both women, both armed. Neither succeeded. Ford stayed calm through it all. He even kept his schedule after the first attempt. There's work to do, he said. He tripped. A lot. Once on the steps of Air Force One. Another time exiting a car, then again on a wet runway. The media fixated. Chevy Chase turned him into a national punchline. Clumsy, they said. But in reality, Ford was athletic, still skied, still swam. He just moved fast and didn't always watch where he was going. He signed the Helsinki Accords, opening the door to human rights diplomacy in Eastern Europe. Critics said he gave too much to the Soviets, but decades later, those accords would be cited by dissidents as moral ammunition. In 1975, Saigon fell. The last U.S. helicopters lifted off the roof of the American embassy. Ford watched the images on TV like the rest of the country. Grim, tired, defeated, he ordered the evacuation of thousands of Vietnamese allies. It wasn't a victory. It was a retreat with grace. He ran for re-election in 1976, barely won his party's nomination against a rising conservative named Ronald Reagan, then faced a fresh-faced Georgia governor, Jimmy Carter. The race was close. Ford stumbled in a debate saying there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. He meant it philosophically. The press took it literally. The moment stuck. He lost. Barely. And yet, when he left office, he was not reviled, not scandalized, just released. He returned to private life, wrote his memoirs, gave speeches, played golf. Slowly, the anger over the Nixon pardon faded. By the time of his death in 2006, he was regarded with something rare, gentle respect, even admiration. His tomb reads, "Lives not words, express the truth." And the man who followed him into office arrived with a toothy grin, a southern accent, and a promise to never lie. Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer, the outsider, the man who believed the presidency was a moral contract and discovered just how hard it was to keep it. Jimmy Carter ran for president like he had something to prove, not to the country, but to himself. A peanut farmer, a Navy veteran, a Sunday school teacher from Plains, Georgia, Carter arrived on the national stage with a deep drawl, a wide grin, and a promise, "I'll never lie to you." After Watergate, that line wasn't just a slogan, it was an exorcism. He was an outsider, deliberately, defiantly so. He refused the cynicism of Washington. He quoted the Bible in policy meetings. He shook every hand in Iowa, introduced himself to voters as Jimmy, told them he loved them, sometimes said grace at campaign stops. His campaign was built on humility and exhaustion. America's exhaustion with secrets, with scandals, with shadows. He won in 1976 by threading that needle between idealism and desperation. Then came the reality. Carter walked to his inauguration, not in a limo, not behind bulletproof glass, just out in the open, waving. It was symbolic, transparency, humility, people's government. He wore his faith like a pocket square, spoke of human rights like gospel, refused to use the word enemy in speeches. He was hopeful and sincere, and often in over his head. He micromanaged, read every memo, edited details down to font size, controlled thermostat settings in the White House to save energy. Staff joked he might personally audit office pens. He returned letters to citizens with handwritten notes. His workdays were long, exacting, emotionally sincere, and politically ineffective. His cabinet never gelled. Infighting broke out early. He would reshuffle it dramatically halfway through his term. Loyalty was rare. Consensus was rarer. His moral compass was true, but his political instincts often left him adrift. He brokered peace in the Middle East. The 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel were Carter's crowning achievement. 13 days of high-stakes negotiation between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. Carter worked like a marriage counselor, took walks with each man, hand-delivered letters, sketched maps, read psalms, and when peace was signed, he wept. It wasn't strategy, it was conviction. But while he made peace abroad, he struggled to keep order at home. The economy imploded, inflation soared, unemployment rose, interest rates hit the stratosphere, gas lines stretched around blocks. America entered what Carter himself called a crisis of confidence. He gave a speech about it in 1979. Earnest, philosophical, now known as the Malaise speech, though he never used the word. He told Americans they had lost faith in themselves. They didn't want therapy. They wanted action. Then came Iran. In 1979, Iranian revolutionaries overthrew the Shah, an autocrat the U.S. had long supported. The Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power. In November, militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. 52 Americans were taken hostage. Carter tried diplomacy, then sanctions, then a covert rescue operation, Operation Eagle Claw. It failed. Helicopters crashed in the desert. 8 servicemen died. No hostages were freed. The images humiliated the U.S., burned wreckage in the sand, hostages blindfolded on foreign television. Carter bore it all with clenched humility. He refused to make the hostages campaign material, refused to celebrate their pain. He stayed up every night writing letters to their families. But the damage was done. In 1980, Carter faced Ronald Reagan, a master of optimism, a communicator with poise and polish. Carter looked tired. Reagan smiled. Carter talked policy. Reagan said, "There you go again." The debate wasn't even close. Neither was the election. Reagan won in a landslide. But the hostages? They were released minutes after Reagan took the oath of office. Carter had negotiated the deal, but never claimed credit, never raised his voice. Just flew to Germany to greet them home, quietly. After leaving office, Carter did something no president had done before. He kept going. He founded the Carter Center, monitored elections in 100 countries, built houses with Habitat for Humanity, spoke out on disease, war, poverty, and injustice, sometimes controversially, always sincerely. He became, in time, the model for post-presidency. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He taught Sunday school into his 90s, got cancer, survived, fell, got back up, smiled, and reminded everyone that decency and difficulty can coexist. He didn't change America while he was president, but he redefined what an ex-president could be. And the man who followed him was the opposite in nearly every way. An actor, a symbol, a man who turned politics into performance and lit the stage like he'd always known the spotlight was waiting. Ronald Reagan, Ronald Wilson. Reagan didn't walk into the presidency. He stepped onto a set already built for him. The lighting was just right. The timing perfect, and the lines delivered with that gravel-warm voice, the twinkle in the eye, and just enough pause for applause. He was the great communicator, the first true cinematic president, not because he pretended, but because he believed, and made others believe too. He was born in Tampico, Illinois, above a bakery, raised on radio serials, Boy Scout values, and small-town hardship. Called Dutch as a boy, played football, was nearly blind without glasses, read everything he could get his hands on. Eventually, he made his way west, where his voice and face found their perfect match. Hollywood. He starred in B-movies, cowboy flicks, military dramas, romantic farces. Not the A-list, but consistent. He became president of the Screen Actors Guild, fought communists in the unions, delivered lines with authority. He once said, "The most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Millions cheered. Bureaucrats winced. By the 1960s, Reagan had shifted from acting to activism. Hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He gave a televised speech for Barry Goldwater in 1964 that electrified conservatives. In it, he warned of creeping socialism, moral decay, and foreign weakness. He wasn't yet running for anything, but the spotlight had found him again. In 1966, he became governor of California. In 1980, after losing a previous presidential bid, he defeated Jimmy Carter with a blend of sunny confidence and ruthless clarity. Inflation, gas shortages, Iran. Reagan seemed to wave them all away with a grin and a new script. His campaign slogan was simple: "Let's make America great again." He believed government was the problem. He cut taxes, slashed regulations, and preached free markets like gospel. He ushered in what became known as Reaganomics, a blend of supply-side theory, deficit, denial, and faith in the private sector. The rich got richer, the economy boomed, the national debt exploded. He survived an assassination attempt just 69 days into his first term, March 30th, 1981. John Hinckley Jr., obsessed with Jodie Foster, shot Reagan outside a Washington hotel. A bullet pierced his lung. As he was wheeled into surgery, Reagan looked at the doctors and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." Even the ones who weren't laughed. He nearly died. He came back smiling. Reagan was a paradox. Fiercely anti-communist, yet willing to meet with Soviet leaders. He called the USSR the evil empire, but later signed landmark nuclear arms reduction treaties with Mikhail Gorbachev. The two met, shook hands, and dismantled missiles. He said, "Trust, but verify." And they did. He visited the Berlin Wall, stood with one hand on the podium, the other in history, and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It took a few years, but it fell. He believed in strength through military buildup, Star Wars missile defense systems, massive Pentagon budgets, Cold War saber rattling. Critics feared he'd bring the world to the brink. Instead, he helped end the Cold War. Though historians still debate how much was luck, how much was legacy. He wasn't big on details, sometimes confused names. Once called trees the biggest polluters, referred to African nations as those little countries. His staff learned to keep briefings short, charts colorful, and speeches full of stories. Reagan governed by instinct, not spreadsheets, and stories. He told them constantly about American cowboys, about freedom, about welfare queens, and shining cities on hills. Some were true, many weren't, but they worked. Because Reagan didn't need you to believe the facts, he needed you to believe the feeling. His second term was battered by the Iran-Contra scandal, a covert operation where arms were sold to Iran and profits secretly funneled to Nicaraguan rebels. It was illegal, it was chaotic, and somehow Reagan remained largely untouched. "I don't recall," he said repeatedly in testimony. The phrase became armor. He left office in 1989 with sky-high approval ratings. The oldest president to serve at the time, smiled, waved, disappeared into California. Years later, he revealed his Alzheimer's diagnosis in a handwritten letter. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." It was a Reagan sentence, graceful, distant, and devastating. He died in 2004. His funeral was cinematic. Flags, bugles, horse-drawn caisson. A nation paused to remember the man who had made optimism feel like strategy, and the man who followed him had been waiting for years. George H.W. Bush. A war hero, a statesman, a pragmatist in a world that was about to demand poetry. George H.W. Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush was not a man of slogans. He was a man of resumes. Navy pilot, Yale graduate, CIA director, congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, head of the Republican National Committee, envoy to China, vice president of the United States. He didn't run for office so much as rise into it, one diplomatic post, one duty-bound pivot at a time. And when he finally reached the Oval Office in 1989, he seemed almost too qualified. The joke was that Bush had spent his whole life preparing to be president, except for learning how to explain why he wanted it. He was awkward in public, affable in private. He called people pal, old sport, my friend. He wrote more thank you notes than perhaps any modern president, handwritten, full of ellipses and underlines. Phrases like 1,000 points of light and wouldn't be prudent. His speech patterns were famously meandering. He'd begin a sentence, detour mid-thought, land somewhere near the topic, then signal to his audience with a tight smile and a breathy, "Okay." He hated talking about himself, thought it was bad form. He once called it the vision thing, said he didn't have one. What he had was experience, gravitas, and an old-fashioned sense of public service, shaped not by ideology, but by duty. He'd flown combat missions in World War II, shot down over the Pacific at age 20. He bailed out, floated into the sea, was rescued by a U.S. submarine. The image followed him, a young man adrift, yet saved, never quite claiming heroism, just repeating, "I was lucky." He inherited a stable economy, oversaw the fall of the Berlin Wall, watched the Soviet Union collapse, not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. He didn't gloat. He managed, carefully, thoughtfully. He sent letters to Gorbachev, offering cooperation, encouraged unity in Germany, patience in Eastern Europe. Historians would later say he ended the Cold War with quiet diplomacy. Then came Iraq. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Bush didn't hesitate. He built a coalition of over 30 countries, worked through the United Nations, gave Saddam a deadline, then launched Operation Desert Storm, a 42-day war, precision bombing, ground troops, a sweeping victory. His approval rating hit 89%. He could have ridden it into re-election, but then came the economy and a broken promise. During the 1988 campaign, Bush had said 6 now infamous words: "Read my lips, no new taxes." The line had electrified conservatives, but as deficits mounted, he raised taxes anyway. Quietly, reluctantly, with bipartisan negotiation, the economy dipped into recession, and with it, his support. Voters felt betrayed. Critics called him out of touch. A supermarket scanner gaffe became legend. He appeared confused by the device, a symbol, accurate or not, of detachment from daily life. In 1992, he faced Bill Clinton, a saxophone-playing youthful governor from Arkansas who could talk feelings and policy in the same breath. Ross Perot entered as a third-party wildcard. The vote split. Clinton won. Bush left graciously, wrote Clinton a now famous letter: "Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you." It was handwritten, heartfelt, and thoroughly Bush. He returned to Texas, skydived on his 75th, 80th, 85th, and 90th birthdays, watched his son become president, worked on tsunami relief with Bill Clinton, his former rival turned friend. The two became an unlikely duo, the elder statesman and the comeback kid. Bush lived a long, quiet post-presidency, wrote letters, received visitors, rarely gave speeches. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "That I served, that I loved my family, that I did my best." He died in 2018 at age 94, mourned as the last of a certain kind of American leader, humble, disciplined, and allergic to self-congratulation. And the man who followed him in 1993 was everything Bush was not: flashy, verbose, scandal-prone, and brilliant at talking about pain. Bill Clinton, the comeback king, the policy nerd with a rock star's swagger. Bill Clinton. William Jefferson. Clinton was the first American president born after World War II, and he brought with him a new tempo, a new vernacular, and a saxophone. He was a Southern boy who taught himself to speak in code switches, policy to professors, empathy to town halls, ambition to everyone. He felt your pain, and if you gave him a minute, he could explain it, fix it, and turn it into a story you want to hear again. He was charisma incarnate. When he walked into a room, the oxygen tilted toward him. His handshake lasted 3 beats too long. He'd remember your name, your cousin's name, the details of your job, and probably your dog's breed. Then he'd use all of it in a story during a stump speech 6 months later. He was born in Hope, Arkansas, raised by his mother, Virginia, and his stepfather, who was abusive and alcoholic. The pain didn't define him. It sharpened him. He learned early how to talk his way out of chaos, became a Rhodes Scholar, studied law, became governor of Arkansas at just 32. By 46, he was running for president, pushing past a war hero incumbent, a billionaire third-party candidate, and a media environment still skeptical of his smoothness. He played Heartbreak Hotel on the Arsenio Hall show with Ray-Bans and a grin. He won the presidency in 1992 and took the baby boomer generation into the White House with him. His presidency was part think tank, part roller coaster. He governed like a centrist technocrat with a heart, cut welfare, balanced the budget, signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, created the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, appointed the first female attorney general, the first female secretary of state, boosted the economy into overdrive. By the end of his second term, the U.S. had a budget surplus for the first time in decades. But for all his intelligence, Clinton was often his own worst opponent. He never stopped campaigning or talking or needing to be liked. His schedule was frenetic. His policy meetings went past midnight. He'd read stacks of memos, mark them up, then call staffers at 2 a.m. to debate a sentence. He didn't just govern, he devoured the work. He was late to everything. His appetite for food, ideas, attention was constant, and that appetite eventually nearly ended his presidency. The scandals began early. Whitewater, Travelgate, Filegate, but nothing stuck until 1998, when news broke of an affair between Clinton and a 22-year-old White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. Clinton denied it. Famously, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." He was lying. The investigation, led by independent counsel Kenneth Starr, expanded into a legal and cultural firestorm. It wasn't just the affair, it was the cover-up, the lying under oath, the parsing of language. The nation split down the seams. Private sin versus public duty, moral failing versus constitutional crisis. He was impeached by the House of Representatives, only the second president in U.S. history to be so. He was acquitted by the Senate. And through it all, his approval ratings climbed. The economy was booming. Unemployment was falling. Wall Street was soaring. Clinton gave State of the Union addresses like nothing had happened. The contradiction was staggering. He was impeached and popular, brilliant and reckless, empathetic and egocentric, a walking contradiction who made contradiction feel almost normal. He liked fast food and wonkish reports, played saxophone and brokered peace in the Balkans, talked about globalization in a way that made it sound like a backyard barbecue, balanced the budget, and left the moral accounting to history. He left office in January 2001 with high approval and a bitter political legacy. In his post-presidency, he built the Clinton Foundation, focused on global health, climate change, education, gave speeches, wrote memoirs, survived heart surgery, became, at times, more admired than during his presidency. But he also remained tethered to the past by scandal, by criticism, by the cultural shift his story helped trigger. And the man who followed him into the White House arrived with contested ballots, hanging chads, and the weight of dynasty, George W. Bush, the son of a president, the candidate of certainty, who would go from punchline to wartime leader in a single September morning. George W. Bush, George Walker. Bush entered the presidency under a cloud of uncertainty, literally, with Florida recounts, hanging chads, and a Supreme Court decision that stopped the clock. He lost the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. And just like that, the son of a president, a man known more for nicknames and brush clearing than policy depth, stepped into the most powerful office in the world. He called himself the Decider. Others called him lucky or lost or both. He was folksy, not polished, known for malapropisms, misunderestimated, nuclear, the internets. Critics mocked him mercilessly. He didn't care. He stayed on message like a metronome. His favorite phrase, "We're gonna smoke 'em out." He was born into privilege, but styled himself as a man of the people. Raised in Texas, spoke with a twang so thick it seemed surgically implanted, had once been a heavy drinker, found Jesus, quit cold turkey, became governor of Texas, ran as a compassionate conservative, said he'd bring dignity back to the White House. It was all working until it wasn't, because 8 months into his presidency, on a clear September morning in 2001, everything changed. Smoke rising from Manhattan while the president sat in a Florida classroom reading The Pet Goat. For 7 minutes he stayed still. Then came the war footing. Bush addressed the nation that night. Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. He meant it, with every fiber of his being. He launched the war on terror. First Afghanistan. The early days were swift, brutal, and successful. Then came the mission creep. Then came Iraq. In 2003, Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He spoke of mushroom clouds and smoking guns. Colin Powell went before the UN with charts and vials. The bombs dropped. The statue of Saddam fell. But the weapons weren't there. The war dragged on. Insurgency, sectarian violence, years of troop surges, body counts, and shifting justifications. Mission accomplished banners turned into political anchors. At home, Bush pushed through sweeping tax cuts, passed No Child Left Behind, created the Department of Homeland Security, signed the Patriot Act. His critics warned of government overreach. His supporters called it strength. He was reelected in 2004 narrowly, campaigned on moral values. The country was divided, but Bush knew how to talk to his base. His certainty was unwavering. "I'm the president," he said, "and the decisions I make are with the interest of the country in mind." Then came Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans underwater, a slow federal response. Americans stranded on rooftops while FEMA flailed. Bush flew over the devastation. The photo, him peering out the plane window, became symbolic of detachment. His approval ratings cratered. Then came the financial crisis. Lehman Brothers collapsed. The stock market tumbled. Housing markets imploded. Bush, the free market president, approved a massive federal bailout. "I've abandoned free market principles," he said, to save the free market system. By then, the country was exhausted. 2 wars, a recession, a fractured nation. Bush didn't complain. He didn't lash out. He simply packed his bags and went back to Texas. His post-presidency was quiet. He took up painting. Portraits of veterans, world leaders, his dog. He rarely spoke against his successors, refused to be a pundit, said the presidency was bigger than personal opinion. He became likable, even among former critics. And as history reevaluated him, the nation wondered, was he worse than we thought or better than we feared? He was, as ever, hard to pin down, and the man who followed him was his opposite in every way. Barack Obama. A soaring speaker, a former community organizer, the first black president of the United States, whose very presence in the White House redefined what the word president could mean. Barack Obama, Barack Hussein. Obama entered the presidency not just as a man, but as a symbol, an embodiment of hope, of history, of a country trying to become something better than it had ever been. He wasn't just elected, he was summoned by recession, by fatigue, by the collective yearning for something that felt like change and sounded like poetry. He was the son of a Kenyan economist and a Kansas-born anthropologist, raised in Hawaii, spent formative years in Indonesia, organized communities in Chicago, taught constitutional law, wrote books that actually read like books. When he spoke, he didn't just address the crowd, he gathered them with rhythm, with restraint, with the precision of a man who knew every word was a fuse. He ran on hope and change. And in 2008, America said yes. He walked into the White House as the economy burned, banks collapsing, foreclosures skyrocketing, job losses measured in millions. He passed a massive stimulus package, saved the auto industry, tightened Wall Street regulations with the Dodd-Frank Act. It was not glamorous. It was triage. But it worked. He inherited 2 wars. In 2011, he ordered a Navy SEAL raid in Pakistan that killed the most wanted man in the world. He announced the news with calm gravity. Justice has been done. No chest thumping, just closure. Long overdue. But his presidency was not just foreign policy or economics. It was identity. He was the first black president. Every sentence, every gesture, every controversy carried weight beyond politics. His tan suit caused outrage. His birth certificate became a political weapon. A sitting congressman shouted, "You lie," during a joint session of Congress. He endured more death threats than any previous president. He answered most of it with dignity. And when asked about racism, he answered carefully, always carefully. In 2010, he signed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. It became his signature achievement and his political scar tissue. It expanded healthcare to millions, survived dozens of repeal attempts. But it also fueled a decade of partisan firestorms. Republicans called it socialism. Obama called it a start. He won the Nobel Peace Prize early in his presidency, awkwardly. He said he didn't feel he deserved it. The world wanted him to be something he hadn't yet become. He was pragmatic, not radical. Preferred evolution to revolution. Some on the left grew impatient. Some on the right never accepted him, but he moved forward inch by inch. He supported same-sex marriage, ended "Don't ask, don't tell," spoke at Charleston's Emmanuel AME Church after a white supremacist massacre, and sang "Amazing Grace" from the pulpit, voice trembling. It wasn't a performance. It was a moment when the office bent toward morning. He loved basketball, danced offbeat, made dad jokes, wrote his own speeches, read briefing books cover to cover. He was cerebral, sometimes aloof, often described as cool, but behind the calm was calculation. He didn't govern emotionally. He governed surgically, and yet the emotional weight was always there. In Newtown, after 20 children were murdered in a school, he cried. In Flint, he drank the water on camera to reassure a poisoned city. In Charleston, he sang. And in every speech, he reminded Americans that democracy wasn't magic. It was maintenance. His second term brought Iran nuclear negotiations, diplomatic openings with Cuba, and clashes with an increasingly hostile Congress. He used executive orders when legislation stalled. Critics cried overreach. Supporters called it necessity. By 2016, the country was weary of hope, of obstruction, of each other, and the election that followed brought the sharpest whiplash in modern political memory. Donald Trump, a billionaire, a reality TV star, a man who questioned Obama's citizenship and would soon question the very office he was about to inherit. Donald J. Trump. Donald John Trump didn't run for president. He branded for it. A billionaire real estate mogul turned reality TV host, Trump entered the 2016 race like a ratings stunt gone rogue. Golden escalator, red tie, thunderous promises. He wasn't a politician. That was the point. He didn't read policy briefs. He didn't apologize. He didn't pivot. He sold himself like a skyscraper, bold, garish, towering, impossible to ignore. And to the shock of pollsters, pundits, and half the planet, he won. It began as a spectacle. The rallies were massive, the slogans sharp: build the wall, drain the swamp, make America great again. He weaponized Twitter. He mocked his rivals. He nicknamed them like a playground bully with a digital megaphone: Little Marco, Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe. He understood media not as a platform, but as a bloodstream. His presidency pulsed through it. He won the Electoral College while losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million, but his base was firm, loud, and loyal. His inauguration speech was defiant, apocalyptic, American carnage. He spoke of rusted factories, crime, forgotten people. He promised only he could fix it. The institutions braced. In his first week, he issued a travel ban targeting several Muslim-majority countries. Airports erupted in protest. Courts challenged the move. Chaos became currency. Every day brought a headline. Every headline brought a tweet. Every tweet, an aftershock. He governed by instinct, not ideology. Cut taxes, slashed regulations, appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, shifting the balance for a generation. He held bizarre photo ops, tossed paper towels in Puerto Rico, hugged flags, called himself a very stable genius, hosted fast food banquets in the White House, compared nuclear buttons with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, and then met with him. No president had ever done that. He aligned with authoritarian leaders, doubted NATO, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, from the Iran nuclear deal, from the World Health Organization, from anything he felt constrained by. America First wasn't a slogan, it was a doctrine. Then came the investigations. Russia, collusion, obstruction of justice, the Mueller report, endless headlines, endless denials. Trump called it a witch hunt. Mueller didn't charge him, but didn't exonerate him either. Then came Ukraine. A phone call, a request for a favor, military aid frozen, impeachment. For the first time in U.S. history, a president was impeached for what he said on a call. Then came the pandemic. COVID-19 swept the globe. Over 1 million Americans would eventually die. Trump downplayed it, pushed unproven treatments, held rallies, refused to wear masks, mocked scientists. The economy collapsed. Hospitals overflowed. Meanwhile, he insisted everything was under control. Then came the summer of protest. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter, the largest civil rights demonstrations since the 1960s. Trump deployed federal agents, stood in front of a church holding a Bible. The country burned and boiled. He doubled down. In November 2020, he lost re-election to Joe Biden by over 7 million votes. He refused to concede, claimed fraud, filed lawsuits, pressured state officials, tweeted relentlessly. His supporters gathered, his rhetoric sharpened. Then, on January the 6th, 2021, they stormed the U.S. Capitol. An insurrection. Congress fled. Windows shattered. Flags waved. Trump flags. 5 people died. Trump watched from the White House. Hours passed before he told them to go home. We love you. You're very special. He was impeached a second time. Acquitted again. He left office without attending the inauguration. First time in 152 years. He retreated to Mar-a-Lago and didn't retreat at all. He launched a media platform, teased a return, rallied, stayed in the bloodstream, and for all the chaos, he reshaped the Republican Party, transformed political communication, redefined what post-truth politics looked like. To some, he was the most dangerous president in American history. To others, a necessary wrecking ball. And the man who followed him, quiet, measured, a career politician who walked into office with masks, vaccines, and a country fractured beyond rhetoric. Joseph R. Biden Jr., the oldest president in American history, and perhaps the final act in an age of American reinvention. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. became president with more miles behind him than most Americans have driven. He took the oath at 78 years old, the oldest man ever to hold the office. After 5 decades in public life, 2 failed presidential runs, the death of 2 children, an aneurysm, and a front row seat to American power at its most polished and its most broken. If Trump was disruption, Biden was restoration. At least that's how he framed it. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, working class, Irish Catholic, a stutterer as a child. He practiced speeches in the mirror, memorized poetry to tame the tremble in his voice. By 29, he was elected to the Senate. A few weeks later, his wife and infant daughter were killed in a car crash. Biden nearly quit politics. Instead, he took the oath beside his surviving sons, Beau and Hunter, in a hospital room. For decades, he commuted from Delaware to Washington by train. Every day, they called him Amtrak Joe. He never let go of that identity, the middle-class senator, the bridge builder, the handshaker who remembered your dad's job and your mom's name. As Barack Obama's vice president, he played the loyal number 2. In private, he advised. In public, he smiled and pointed. When Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2017, Biden wept. "I had no idea," he said. He meant it. In 2020, he ran for president again. This time as a kind of national salve. He promised to restore decency, to beat the pandemic, to build back better. He barely campaigned in person. Let Trump implode. Focused on empathy, on competence, on not being Donald Trump. He won and inherited a mess. COVID-19 still raging. An economy limping. A vaccine rollout just beginning. Mistrust boiling over. The Capitol still recovering from insurrection. Biden walked into the White House with a mask on and a whisper in his voice. "We must end this uncivil war," he said at his inauguration. It sounded like a prayer and a dare. He signed executive orders at a record pace, rejoined the Paris Agreement, reversed Trump's immigration bans, launched a massive vaccine campaign, passed a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, delivered child tax credits, expanded unemployment benefits. He did it all with the smallest congressional majority imaginable. And yet, challenges multiplied. The withdrawal from Afghanistan unraveled in real time. Chaos at the Kabul airport. Deaths. Panic. A war that lasted 20 years ended in images of desperation. Biden stood by the decision. "I was the 4th president," he said. "I would not pass this war on to a 5th. Inflation rose. Supply chains buckled. COVID variants mutated. Poll numbers sagged. But Biden kept going, deliberate, unfazed, sometimes slow. His speeches mixed moral clarity with verbal misfires. He often whispered into the mic, clenched his fists mid-sentence, and sometimes lost track of his own phrasing. The press dissected every pause. He signed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, one of the largest in decades. Roads, bridges, broadband, a rare bipartisan achievement. He nominated and saw confirmed the first black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. He also signed major climate legislation through the Inflation Reduction Act, the most sweeping environmental investment in U.S. history. Quietly, methodically, Biden did what his critics claimed he couldn't. He passed laws. Yet his presidency often felt like a ghost of another time. He quoted scripture, spoke of unity, whispered when the world screamed. In a TikTok era, Biden governed like it was still 1987. Press releases, handshake politics, Amtrak metaphors.